the lights of Pallet Town have always burned quieter than the rest of Kanto, as though the region itself understood that some things are better left for night. Beneath every familiar route and remembered gym battle, the Kanto region holds questions that were never fully answered. The world that trained a generation of players carried within it shadows and silences that the games never bothered to explain. And before you drift any further, consider subscribing for more calming journeys like this, and thank you for helping us gently approach 2,000 subscribers tonight. There are 151 Pokemon native to this region, and hidden inside each of them is a mystery waiting to be examined slowly, one careful detail at a time. The first Pokemon most trainers ever chose was not chosen at random. Professor Oak placed 3 creatures on a table in his laboratory, and the moment felt simple and ordinary. But the reasoning behind exactly which 3 Pokemon were selected and why those particular creatures happened to be available in a small-town laboratory was never explained. Bulbasaur, Charmander, and Squirtle were not wild Pokemon caught near Pallet Town. They did not belong to that environment naturally. Oak had obtained them from somewhere or someone, and the games never offered a clear account of how they arrived or what their origins actually were. Bulbasaur carries a seed on its back from the moment it is born. The Pokédex describes that seed as germinating and absorbing sunlight alongside the creature as it grows. Over time, the bulb opens into a flower, transforming a Pokemon already unusual into something that blends plant biology with animal movement in ways that remain scientifically strange, even within the logic of the Pokemon world. The seed is not simply attached to Bulbasaur externally. It grows with the creature, changes with the creature, and appears to be genuinely fused with its body at a biological level. Whether the seed controls Bulbasaur in any way, or whether Bulbasaur controls the seed, is a question the games never seriously addressed. Charmander presents a different kind of mystery entirely. The flame burning at the tip of its tail is not simply decorative. According to the Pokédex, the flame reflects the creature's life force directly. When the flame burns brightly, Charmander is healthy and full of energy. When it begins to weaken, so does the Pokemon itself. And if the flame goes out, Charmander does not survive. This detail was presented as fact in early entries and never fully walked back by later descriptions. It raises an obvious question that the games never asked aloud. What happens during rain? What happens during a storm severe enough to threaten a flame that small? The world around Charmander contains weather, bodies of water, and conditions entirely capable of extinguishing something so fragile. Yet Charmander as a species clearly continues to exist, which means either the flame is more resilient than it appears, or the Pokédex description leaves important details out. Squirtle's origins contain their own quiet strangeness. Its shell, described as a rounded surface that deflects attacks and provides defensive protection, is not simply armor that Squirtle wears. It is part of the creature's body, grown naturally, and its curved shape is said to reduce water resistance when Squirtle swims. This suggests a level of biological design that implies purpose, as though the shell evolved specifically to serve hydrodynamic function alongside combat protection. Evolution, as a process in the natural world, does not usually produce outcomes that precise. The shell seems almost engineered rather than developed through natural chance, which raises quiet questions about how Pokemon biology actually works and whether the word evolution means the same thing inside this world as it does outside it. These 3 creatures, placed side by side on a laboratory table, each carried within them a kind of biological wonder that Professor Oak had apparently grown accustomed to. He studied Pokemon for his entire professional life, and his Pokédex project asked trainers to gather information on every species in the region. Yet Oak himself never traveled the routes. He sent young people, barely old enough to navigate independently, into a world full of creatures capable of generating lightning, breathing fire, and summoning storms. The reason he gave was that his own Pokemon had grown too strong. That explanation arrived late in the adventure, and it was the only one ever offered. Something about that answer has never quite satisfied the people who thought about it long enough. A researcher whose life's work depends on observing Pokemon in their natural environments chose to study them from a laboratory instead. He gathered data through others and cataloged what they sent back. The Pokédex entries he contributed to are sometimes contradictory, sometimes unsettling, and occasionally describe behaviors that would be considered dangerous to observe up close. Perhaps Oak understood something about direct contact with the Pokemon world that his cheerful demeanor never communicated openly. Perhaps the routes between towns are less safe than a child's adventure suggests. Or perhaps the old professor simply found ways to remain comfortable while others took the risks his work required. The relationship between Professor Oak and the player's rival introduces another layer of quiet strangeness. The rival is Oak's own grandson, and Oak famously forgets his name at the beginning of the adventure, requiring the player to provide it. That moment has been treated as a lighthearted quirk for decades, but if taken seriously within the story, a grandfather forgetting the name of a grandchild he lives near is genuinely unusual. The rival appears frequently, is clearly known to the professor, and is allowed access to Oak's laboratory and starter Pokemon. The name forgetting feels less like an oversight and more like something the game never found the right way to explain. The rival himself evolves in unexpected ways throughout the adventure. He begins confident and dismissive, challenging the player at every opportunity and treating Pokemon as tools for personal glory. But by the time he is encountered in Lavender Town, something has shifted. His tone has changed. A small piece of dialogue suggests he may have lost a Pokemon, though the games never confirmed this directly. He becomes quieter, less certain. His journey from aggressive competitor to eventual Pokemon League champion follows a path that the player witnesses without ever fully understanding. He wins the title before the player arrives, and then disappears from his grandfather's laboratory, replaced by a different mood entirely. Something happened to him during that journey. The route he traveled, the things he witnessed, changed him in ways the story acknowledged without ever explaining. If the rival lost a Pokemon during the adventure, that event would make him one of the earliest characters in the series to experience Pokemon death as a personal loss. The games generally avoid addressing this possibility directly. Pokemon faint during battle and recover. Healing is available in every town. The world is designed around resilience and return. Yet the Lavender Town section of Kanto exists precisely because Pokemon do die, because trainers grieve them, and because the bond between a person and their Pokemon leaves traces behind even after the creature is gone. The rival's behavior in that town suggests he understood something about that bond that the cheerful exterior of his early appearances had hidden entirely. Pallet Town itself contains a mystery that sits at the very beginning of the adventure. The town is small, 2 houses, a laboratory, and a stretch of tall grass at its southern edge, separating the town from the wider world. No routes arrive from the south. The water at the bottom of Pallet Town cannot be crossed without a specific ability taught much later in the adventure. This means Pallet Town is effectively surrounded. A tiny, isolated location with one road leading north toward the rest of Kanto and natural barriers on every other side. The people who live there are few, and the lab sits at the center of the community, like the only building that matters. The question of why the world's foremost Pokemon researcher chose to base his entire operation in a location this remote was never asked and never answered within the games themselves. Route 1 connects Pallet Town to Viridian City, and it is the first route most trainers ever walked. The Pokemon living there are modest. Pidgey moves through the tall grass quietly. Rattata appears suddenly and briefly. Neither creature suggests that the route is particularly significant, but Viridian City, the destination at the end of that first walk, contains its own strangeness. The gym there belongs to the most powerful trainer in the region, and it remains locked for almost the entire adventure. The gym leader is absent. His reason for being elsewhere is never explained. He is eventually encountered only at the very end, and his identity, when finally revealed, changes how the entire journey is understood in retrospect. Giovanni leads Team Rocket. He runs a criminal organization responsible for theft, illegal Pokemon harvesting, and experiments that caused suffering to Pokemon and humans alike. He also serves as the final gym leader in the Kanto circuit, a gatekeeper built into the official structure of a challenge, meant to test trainers and certify their skills. The fact that a criminal enterprise leader occupied an official position within the sport and governance of the region raises questions that extend far beyond the adventure itself. Giovanni was not operating in secret. His gym was a known location with a known address. The Pokemon League, whatever governing body administered badges and championship access, had either failed to notice his identity or chosen to ignore it entirely. The Pokemon League structure in Kanto is never fully explained. 8 gym leaders exist across the region, each representing an official test of trainer skill. Badges collected from these leaders grant access to the Victory Road Tunnel and eventually the Elite Four. But who appointed the gym leaders? Who oversaw their conduct? What organization held them accountable? These questions have no answers within the original games. Giovanni's position suggests that the system had significant gaps in oversight, or that powerful trainers operated with a level of autonomy that made accountability difficult even in principle. Team Rocket's operations throughout Kanto were extensive and organized. They maintained a base beneath the Game Corner in Celadon City, a gambling establishment with a hidden criminal headquarters accessible through a back entrance that the games treated as straightforward investigation. They operated in Lavender Town. They controlled the Sylph Company building in Saffron City long enough to hold employees hostage and attempt to steal advanced research. Each of these operations required planning, personnel, resources, and communication networks. The scale of what Team Rocket accomplished in Kanto before a young trainer dismantled it suggests an organization that had been functioning for considerable time without serious interference. Giovanni's gym position was perhaps the most visible sign of a criminal enterprise that had embedded itself deeply into the region's legitimate structures. Sylph Company developed the Master Ball, a Pokeball capable of catching any Pokemon without failure. The technology required to build such a device implies an understanding of Pokemon biology advanced enough to guarantee containment, regardless of species, strength, or resistance. The games present this as a single remarkable achievement, but the implications stretch further. If Sylph could design a containment device guaranteed to work on any Pokemon, what else did their research make possible? The Sylph Scope, recovered during the Lavender Town section of the adventure, allowed trainers to perceive ghost-type Pokemon that would otherwise appear as shapeless figures. The technology that makes Pokemon visible to human observation and the technology that makes them catchable both came from the same company. Sylph Company understood Pokemon in ways that no publicly available information fully explained. The Master Ball was given to the player after Team Rocket was driven from the building. President Sylph presented it as a gift, offering the most powerful catching device in existence to a young trainer who happened to arrive at the right moment. The rarity of that technology, combined with the casualness with which it was handed over, suggests that either Sylph had additional units in production or that the president felt gratitude strong enough to offer something irreplaceable. Neither explanation was ever confirmed. The Master Ball itself has appeared in every subsequent region, manufactured or obtained through different means each time, which suggests that the technology eventually spread beyond Sylph's original production and became something the broader world of Pokemon technology could replicate. The Pokemon storage system that Bill created, which allowed trainers to carry only 6 Pokemon while keeping others accessible through computer terminals across the region, represented a different kind of technological achievement. Pokemon were converted into data, stored digitally, and retrieved on demand. The process was presented as safe and routine. Trainers used it constantly without concern. But the details of what that conversion involved were never described. A living creature with biology, consciousness, and individual personality was turned into information and stored inside a machine. Whether the Pokemon experienced anything during that time, whether something of their awareness persisted in digital form, whether the version retrieved was genuinely identical to the version stored, all of these questions existed beneath the surface of a system that functioned as simple infrastructure. Bill's accident, the moment when he accidentally merged with a Pokemon while testing a transport device near Cerulean City, confirmed that the conversion process worked on humans as well as Pokemon. His consciousness remained intact throughout the fusion. He could speak, reason, and communicate his situation clearly. The experience was temporary and reversible, which might suggest that the conversion process preserved biological information with enough fidelity to allow restoration. But the fact that the merge happened at all, that human and Pokemon biological data could combine through the same technology, implies that somewhere in the structure of how both species work, there is enough compatibility for their information to overlap. That detail was introduced early in the adventure and never revisited. The routes connecting Kanto's towns are full of trainers who initiate battles automatically when the player enters their line of sight. This mechanic, explained as a convention of trainer culture, suggests that challenging strangers to Pokemon battles is considered completely normal social behavior within the region. Bug catchers stand at the edges of paths, waiting for anyone who walks near. Young children block roads until defeated. Hikers descend from mountain paths, specifically to test passing travelers. The culture of Kanto treats combat as greeting, as communication, and as a form of connection between people who may never meet again. What trainers do with the outcome of those encounters, how they process repeated defeats or victories against strangers, was a dimension of daily life the games depicted without analyzing. The trainers waiting on routes were always already there when the player arrived. They never moved. They stood in fixed positions, facing specific directions, apparently waiting. The game presented this as necessary structure rather than strange behavior, but thinking about it plainly, a person standing in tall grass for an indeterminate amount of time, waiting for a stranger to walk past, is an unusual thing to do with an afternoon. The implication is that Pokemon battling is so central to life in Kanto that seeking it out passively, simply by positioning yourself where travelers might pass, was a completely reasonable way to spend time. The culture built around Pokemon shaped human behavior in ways that the adventure moved through without stopping to examine. Cerulean City's gym leader, Misty, specialized in water-type Pokemon and operated a gym directly accessible from the city center. Her 2 older sisters appeared near her gym, described in dialogue as swimmers who sometimes helped with training. The Cerulean City gym itself was built around a large pool, suggesting that the facility had been designed with water battles in mind from its earliest construction. Who built the gym? Who decided that Cerulean would host a water specialist? The geography of Kanto placed Cerulean near water routes and the sea cottage where Bill worked, which might suggest some planning behind which types of Pokemon specialists were positioned where. The pattern of gym types across the region, fire in Cinnabar, ground beneath Viridian, psychic in Saffron, appears deliberate. Someone organized Kanto's gym circuit with thought behind the arrangement. That person, or organization, was never named. Vermilion City's gym leader, Lieutenant Surge, called himself the Lightning American, a description that introduced the concept of different human nations existing within the Pokemon world without elaborating on what those places were like. Surge mentioned his military background in dialogue, stating that his Pokemon had saved his life during combat. This small detail established that war had happened somewhere in the world beyond Kanto, that military forces had existed, and that Pokemon had participated in whatever conflict Surge survived. The nature of that war, where it was fought, and who was involved was never addressed. Surge brought his experience to a coastal city gym and trained electric-type Pokemon with military precision. Whether other gym leaders had similar histories, whether the relative peace of Kanto was a recent development rather than a permanent condition, remained questions the games left entirely open. The SS An, the luxury cruise ship docked in Vermilion City's harbor, hosted a passenger list that included trainers from many different places traveling through Kanto's waters. The ship eventually departed the harbor and was never seen again within the original games. It existed as a location primarily to provide HM01 cut, a technical move taught by the ship's captain in exchange for solving his seasickness. The ship itself, with its dining halls as a guest quarters and population of traveling trainers, represented a glimpse of a world larger than the routes between gyms. People moved across regions. The sea connected Kanto to other places. The SS An was evidence of a broader civilization that the adventure never had time to explore. Rock Tunnel, the passage connecting Route 10 to Lavender Town, was unusual because it required a light source to navigate at all. Without the flash move, the tunnel became nearly impossible to traverse. This presented an interesting question about how the tunnel was originally used before trainers with the right abilities came along. People traveled between Lavender and Cerulean before any particular trainer made the journey. The Pokemon Center near the tunnel entrance suggested regular enough traffic to justify a healing facility. But the darkness inside the tunnel must have been manageable in some way before HM technology arrived. Early map descriptions mentioned that miners had worked the area, which implied that tools and torches had made the passage possible once. The transition from practical mining tunnel to trainer obstacle happened somewhere in the region's history without documentation. Lavender Town's Pokemon Tower was built as a burial place. The graves inside belonged to Pokemon whose trainers had brought them there after death. The architecture of that building, its multiple floors, its monks and caretakers, its deliberate separation from the busier parts of Kanto, suggested that the region had developed specific traditions around Pokemon death. Trainers grieved their Pokemon formally. There was a designated place for that grief, a structure built and maintained for the specific purpose of honoring creatures that had passed. This level of cultural acknowledgement placed Pokemon death within a framework that the rest of the adventure carefully avoided. The tower's existence made clear that Pokemon were not simply tools or companions, but beings whose endings mattered enough to build architecture around. The Pokemon inside the tower, the ghost types that appeared as shapeless forms before the Sylph Scope revealed them, were never explained within the original games. Whether they were drawn to the building because of the spiritual energy gathered there, whether they had always been present and simply became more concentrated as more Pokemon were buried, whether something about the construction of the tower itself attracted them, remained entirely unclear. The monks who maintained the tower seemed aware of their presence and treated them as a natural part of the environment rather than a problem to be solved. Ghastly and Haunter were observable facts of the Lavender Town landscape, accepted without surprise by the people who lived and worked nearby. The Mother Marowak, whose ghost blocked the upper floors of Pokemon Tower, presented the adventure's most direct encounter with Pokemon death as an individual story rather than an abstract concept. Her child, the Cubone that players encounter elsewhere in the tower, wore her skull. That specific detail appeared in Cubone's Pokédex entry and was one of the most affecting pieces of lore in the original games. Whether this particular Cubone was definitively connected to this particular Marowak was never confirmed by in-game text, but the proximity, the timing, and the emotional logic of the story made the connection feel certain to most players who thought about it carefully. A mother had died protecting her child. Her spirit remained because something was unfinished. The child continued without her, wearing what remained. The connection between Cubone and Kangaskhan was the subject of speculation for many years after the original games released. Kangaskhan carried a young Pokemon in its pouch. Cubone wore the skull of its deceased mother. The theory that Cubone might be an orphaned baby Kangaskhan, whose mother had died, leaving the young creature to wear the skull as both memory and mourning, circulated widely enough that it became one of the most discussed pieces of unofficial Pokemon lore. The games never confirmed this, and the species were listed separately with different biological classifications. But the emotional logic of the connection, two species defined by their relationship to a parent, one through presence and one through loss, was striking enough to outlast decades of expanded lore. Kangaskhan itself raised questions about reproduction. Adult Kangaskhan were always depicted with a child in the pouch, but a baby Kangaskhan had never been encountered separately. How young Kangaskhan were born, and how the cycle of parent and child continued across generations, remained biologically unexplained. The Pokédex entries focused on the protective nature of the parent rather than the mechanics of how new Kangaskhan came into being. In a world with detailed ecological implications throughout, the absence of that information was conspicuous. Saffron City was the largest urban center in Kanto, home to the Sylph Company headquarters, a Pokemon dojo, the psychic gym, and enough population density to suggest a functioning metropolitan economy. Two gyms existed within its borders, though only one was officially recognized. The Fighting Dojo had competed with the Psychic Gym for official status and lost, becoming an unofficial training facility where dedicated fighters continued to work without badge recognition. The hierarchy that determined which gym received official status was never explained, but its consequences were visible. The dojo's leader offered the player a Pokemon as consolation for winning, a detail that implied he had accepted his gym's unofficial status permanently rather than seeking to change it. Sabrina led the Saffron Gym and was described in both the games and associated media as having psychic abilities herself. Whether this was a metaphor for her exceptional understanding of psychic-type Pokemon or a literal description of actual psychic power in a human being was never clarified. The games occasionally hinted at humans with unusual abilities, particularly those connected to legendary Pokemon or specific locations. But the systematic existence of psychic humans alongside psychic Pokemon raised questions about whether the two types of ability shared an origin. Sabrina's demeanor in the original games was cold and unsettling in ways that her later appearances softened. Early Sabrina suggested someone whose abilities, whatever their source, had separated her from ordinary human connection in ways she had not chosen. The Pokemon Ditto could transform into any other Pokemon it encountered, replicating their appearance, their moves, and their statistics with enough fidelity to function as a convincing duplicate in battle. This ability was described in Pokédex entries as cellular-level transformation, meaning Ditto physically rearranged its own biology to match another creature. The mechanics of that process, how it could happen quickly enough to be useful in combat, how Ditto's consciousness navigated existing inside the shape of something else, were never addressed. What remained constant was Ditto's face. Even when transformed, Ditto retained its own simple expression, two small dots, and a curve that persisted beneath any form it took. Whether this was a biological limitation or something more meaningful was left to interpretation. Ditto was the only Pokemon in the original roster capable of breeding with almost any other species. Breeding mechanics became explicit in later games, but the biological implications of Ditto's unique compatibility suggested that its transformation was deeper than surface level mimicry. For two Pokemon to produce an egg together requires enough biological compatibility to create viable offspring. Ditto's ability to achieve that compatibility with nearly every species implied that its cellular architecture was genuinely adaptable at a fundamental level. Some researchers within the expanded lore suggested that Ditto might be related to Mew, whose DNA was described as containing the genetic information of all Pokemon. The physical resemblance between the two and the shared quality of biological universality made that connection feel significant, even without official confirmation. Mew's existence in Kanto was not openly acknowledged within the original games. The legendary Pokemon was present in the data of the cartridge, accessible through a specific sequence of actions, but officially undiscovered and unannounced. This made Mew the first example of a Pokemon hidden, not in tall grass or a cave or a specific story location, but in the architecture of the game itself. The discovery of how to encounter Mew spread through schoolyards and communities before reliable internet distribution existed, passed through word of mouth and handwritten notes in ways that made the Pokemon feel genuinely mythic. Players who knew someone who had encountered it treated that chain of knowledge as remarkable. Mew existed in a space between official content and secret, between game design and rumor. The relationship between Mew and Mewtwo was one of the most significant story threads the original games introduced without fully resolving. Scientists from a laboratory on Cinnabar Island had created Mewtwo from a single Mew eyelash, or according to the Pokédex, from Mew's DNA recombined through genetic manipulation. The Cinnabar laboratory burned down before the player arrived, leaving behind journals that described the research process and Mewtwo's eventual destruction of the facility and escape. The scientists had intended to create the strongest Pokemon in existence. They succeeded, and then were unable to contain what they had made. Mewtwo was documented as having psychic power far beyond anything measured in natural Pokemon, and the aftermath of its creation was visible in the ruined laboratory the player explored. The journal entries found in the Cinnabar laboratory were among the most unsettling pieces of writing in the original games. They described Mewtwo's growth from a cellular sample into a fully developed Pokemon, and they tracked the researchers' growing understanding that what they had created was not simply a powerful Pokemon, but something that experienced its existence in ways they had not anticipated. Mewtwo's eventual violence against the laboratory was not described in the journals because the journals ended before that event. The silence at the end of those entries, the place where documentation stopped, was as unsettling as anything the text had said directly. Whatever happened in that laboratory happened without anyone left to write it down. Cinnabar Island itself was built around the laboratory and the Pokemon gym that the gym leader Blaine operated independently of it. Blaine was a researcher as well as a trainer, and his specialty in fire-type Pokemon coexisted with a broader scientific background that the games referenced without fully exploring. The volcanic island provided natural resources that supported fire-type habitation, and Blaine's gym was designed around a quiz mechanic that tested knowledge before allowing trainers to fight. The quiz implied that Blaine valued understanding as well as strength, an approach that distinguished his gym from the pure combat focus of others. Whether Blaine had any connection to the Cinnabar laboratory, whether he had witnessed or known about the Mewtwo project, was never addressed. The fossils available in the Kanto region introduced another dimension of mystery that the games treated as scientific routine. Two fossils, one representing an ancient dome creature and one representing an ancient shell creature, could be revived into living Pokemon through laboratory techniques on Cinnabar Island. Omanite and Kabuto, and their evolved forms, had been extinct for a period measured in millions of years, according to Pokédex entries. The technology that brought them back was available to any trainer who carried a fossil to the right building. Extinct biological organisms were being restored to life as a service offered to travelers. The philosophical and ecological implications of de-extinction were treated as completely unremarkable by everyone in the game world, though what happened to the revived Pokemon after they were handed to a trainer was never described in any detail. Aerodactyl, the third fossil Pokemon available in Kanto, was restored from ancient amber, containing genetic material rather than from a stone fossil. The distinction suggested that different preservation methods yielded different biological information. Aerodactyl was described in Pokédex entries as a savage, violent creature with fangs sharp enough to tear through other Pokemon. Reviving an organism with those behavioral characteristics and immediately handing it to a trainer without any introduction or acclimatization period implied a confidence in the taming process that the games never acknowledged as unusual. Whether Aerodactyl experienced something like confusion or distress upon waking in an environment separated from its own time by an incomprehensible span was not something any character in the game thought to consider. Fuchsia City's Safari Zone was a wildlife preserve where trainers could observe and attempt to catch Pokemon that did not appear naturally anywhere else in the region. The Safari Zone operated on specific rules designed to limit battle damage to the habitat's residents. Trainers threw bait or rocks to influence Pokemon behavior and used special balls to attempt catches. The biological logic of why certain rare Pokemon were concentrated in a single managed preserve rather than distributed across natural habitats was never explained. Someone had gathered Pokemon from elsewhere and established the preserve deliberately. The warden, who managed the Safari Zone, had lost his ability to communicate clearly and needed his missing dentures returned before he could teach the player an important move. The details of what happened to his teeth and why their recovery was necessary for access to a fundamental ability were left entirely to imagination. The Pokemon Chansey worked inside Pokemon centers as nurses and assistants alongside Nurse Joy. This relationship between a human nurse and a Pokemon capable of healing through its eggs suggested a medical system that integrated human and Pokemon practitioners in ways that the games normalized but never explained in detail. Chansey's eggs were described as highly nutritious and possessing restorative properties. The center system built around their availability implied a supply chain, a system by which enough Chansey and enough eggs could support facilities across an entire region. How that system worked, who organized it, and what compensation, if any, Chansey received for their labor were questions that sat quietly beneath an institution the player used constantly without thinking about its structure. Arcanine was called the legendary Pokemon in its Pokédex entry, despite being obtainable through evolution and meeting no criteria that applied to the legendary creatures actually treated as legendary within the broader lore. The legendary Pokemon classification in Arcanine's entry appeared to refer to legendary status within human culture, an animal so magnificent and powerful that ancient stories elevated it to mythic standing without the creature actually possessing the singular nature of true legendary Pokemon. The distinction mattered because it suggested that humans in the Pokemon world had developed their own categories of wonder, independently of the biological distinctions the games eventually applied to the rarest and most powerful creatures. Something could be legendary in the sense of stories and reverence without being legendary in the sense of being singular and irreplaceable. Growlithe, Arcanine's pre-evolved form was noted in Pokédex entries for its loyalty and its willingness to protect its trainer, even at personal risk. The loyalty of dog-type Pokémon appeared across multiple entries and was treated as a defining characteristic of those species. But the nature of that loyalty, whether it developed through domestication over generations, whether it was a biological trait expressed instinctively, or whether Pokemon like Growlithe formed genuine emotional attachments that constituted something closer to chosen devotion, was never analyzed. The games assumed the loyalty and built game mechanics around it. The source and meaning of that loyalty was left for each player to interpret according to their own understanding of what the relationship between a person and a Pokemon actually involved. Eevee was the only Pokemon in the original roster that could evolve into multiple different final forms depending on external conditions. A Water Stone produced Vaporeon, a Thunderstone produced Jolteon, a Firestone produced Flareon. 3 possible outcomes from one creature, with the final form determined by what the trainer chose to provide. Later games would expand Eevee's evolution paths considerably, but in the original Kanto games, those 3 represented the entire range of possibility. The biological mechanism by which a single species could become fundamentally different creatures depending on environmental input was described simply as a reaction to stone exposure. The cellular transformation involved in shifting from normal type biology to water type biology, fire type biology, or electric type biology was presented as a natural outcome of contact with a mineral. Stones in the Pokemon world triggered evolution in multiple species beyond Eevee. Moonstones, fire stones, water stones, thunderstones, leaf stones, and later sunstones all caused specific Pokemon to evolve when used. The distribution of these stones throughout the environment and the fact that wild Pokemon apparently did not simply encounter them in nature and evolve automatically suggested that some regulatory mechanism governed when stone-triggered evolution could occur. Wild Clefairy living near areas with moonstone access did not spontaneously become clefable. The stone had to be deliberately applied. Whether this was a biological safeguard, a feature of how Pokemon evolution actually worked at a cellular level, or simply a convenience of game design that the world had organized itself around, remained one of those questions that the Pokédex entries never directly addressed. Clefairy lived primarily near Mount Moon, a mountainous area rich in moonstone fragments scattered throughout its caves. Pokédex entries connected Clefairy to the moon explicitly, describing them as dancing under moonlight and absorbing lunar energy through their bodies. The connection between Clefairy's biology and celestial phenomena suggested a type of creature that existed in relationship with forces outside the immediate environment in ways that most Pokemon did not. Clefable's description as rarely seen and inhabiting high mountain areas implied that evolution into Clefable was uncommon even under natural conditions. The moonstone that triggered the transition was abundant in the one place where Clefairy congregated, yet wild Clefable were almost never encountered there. The relationship between the stones and the species that lived among them was more complex than simple proximity suggested. Mount Moon itself was notable as a location where Team Rocket had established an operation to collect Pokemon and fossil resources. The presence of Team Rocket throughout Kanto, in such varied locations and with such different operational goals, suggested an organization with both broad ambitions and flexible methods. They collected fossils, they harvested Pokemon, they infiltrated corporate headquarters, they operated casinos, they maintained bases in multiple cities simultaneously. Whatever Giovanni's ultimate goals were, the criminal infrastructure he built was designed for expansion rather than a single focused purpose. Team Rocket in the original games was described as a criminal organization, but its actual structure, its hierarchy, Its finances, its recruitment methods were never detailed. The criminal organization's interest in Pokemon specifically pointed toward a particular vision of power. Pokemon in the Kanto games were shown to be capable of generating electricity, controlling weather, moving objects with psychic force, and producing heat intense enough to melt rock. A human organization that controlled enough Pokemon with those abilities effectively controlled access to power sources, weather modification, and destruction on a scale that conventional human technology in the setting could not match. Giovanni's collection of strong Pokemon was not simply a hobby or a display of strength. It was a form of resource accumulation that translated directly into leverage over anyone who lacked equivalent access. The Pokemon Hypno carried a pendulum and used it to induce sleep in those nearby. Pokédex entries in later games described Hypno as having led children away from their homes in some documented cases, drawn apparently by something the children experienced while hypnotized. Whether Hypno intended this behavior, whether it acted from instinct or from something closer to deliberate choice, was a question the entries introduced without answering. Drowsy, its pre-evolved form, ate dreams. The biological mechanism by which a creature could consume the mental activity of a sleeping being, extract nutritional or energetic value from imaginary content, and produce effects that persisted into waking life, was described in matter-of-fact Pokédex language, without any indication that the researchers who compiled those entries found the ability unusual. In the context of Kanto, dream-eating was simply a thing that Drowsy did. Gengar could lower the temperature of a room simply by being present. Pokédex entries described the sensation of sudden cold as a sign that a Gengar was nearby. The mechanism by which a Pokémon, without any described organ for heat absorption, produced this effect was not explained. The implication appeared to be that ghost-type Pokémon, or at least Gengar specifically, had some relationship with energy in its thermal form that allowed them to absorb or displace it simply through proximity. Whether this was a passive biological characteristic, an active ability used for a purpose, or something Gengar did instinctively without awareness of the effect, was another of those details that Pokédex entries introduced and then moved past without stopping. Haunter's hands, or which existed separately from its body as floating disembodied appendages, were described as capable of causing numbness upon contact, with extended paralysis following prolonged exposure. The description placed Haunter's touch in a category between dangerous and lethal depending on circumstances. What Haunter experienced when using this ability, whether the paralysis was the intended outcome of deliberate action or simply a side effect of contact with something biologically incompatible with human nervous systems, remained unclear. Ghost-type Pokémon across many generations were depicted with abilities that affected consciousness, sensation, and perception in ways that other types did not. Whether this reflected a shared biological heritage among ghost types or a convergent adaptation toward affecting mental states was never addressed systematically. The Pokemon Ghastly, which preceded both Haunter and Gengar in the evolutionary line, was described in some entries as being composed almost entirely of gas. It lacked a solid physical form in the way that other Pokemon possessed one. Its evolution into Haunter, which had more defined shape, and then into Gengar, which had a fully solid silhouette, represented a progression from formlessness toward increasing physical definition. What drove that progression? What changed biologically when a creature composed primarily of gas developed into something that cast a shadow and reflected light consistently was a process the games marked as evolution without explaining. The ghost-type line in Kanto offered the most abstract biological information of any evolutionary family in the original roster. Magikarp was described throughout its Pokédex entries as weak, helpless, and essentially useless. It could barely swim against any current, and knew only one move that could be used in battle at all. The species had been widespread and dominant in ancient times, according to some entries, before its gradual decline into a creature that barely functioned. Yet Magikarp survived everywhere. It populated virtually every body of water in every region. It existed in vast numbers. Its biological success, measured purely in population and distribution, was remarkable for a creature described as entirely ineffective. The entries that mentioned Magikarp's ancient dominance raised questions about what the Pokemon world had looked like before its decline. What had changed? What force had reduced one of the ancient world's dominant species to something young trainers used as an example of weakness? Gyarados, Magikarp's evolved form, was among the most violent and destructive Pokemon documented in the original games. Pokédex entries described Gyarados as capable of destroying entire cities during rampages that lasted for months. The connection between Magikarp and Gyarados, between absolute weakness and catastrophic power, was described as one of the mysteries of the Pokemon world, even within the games themselves. The cellular transformation involved in Magikarp's evolution into Gyarados changed more than form. It apparently changed psychology, physiology, and capabilities so completely that the two forms shared essentially nothing except genetic heritage. How that transformation was metabolically possible, how a creature with almost no functional abilities became one with the capacity for large-scale destruction, was left as a documented mystery rather than an explained phenomenon. The old Gyarados that Lake of Rage and later games highlighted was red rather than blue, a color difference that the games treated as extraordinary. Shiny Pokemon, alternate colored variants of standard species, existed throughout the Pokemon world in extreme rarity. The odds of encountering one through ordinary observation were so low that many trainers never saw one. The existence of these variants raised questions about what caused the color difference. Was it a genetic mutation, an environmental influence, a biological variation equivalent to albinism in natural species? The games treated shiny Pokemon as special and memorable without explaining the mechanism that produced them. Their rarity made them remarkable. Their origin remained one of the quiet, unanswered questions distributed throughout the world. Alakazam was described in Pokédex entries as possessing a brain that continued growing throughout its life, with its intelligence eventually surpassing any human measure. The entries stated it could memorize everything it ever encountered and perform thousands of simultaneous calculations. Whether this constituted something like consciousness in the philosophical sense, whether Alakazam's increasing intelligence eventually reached a level that changed how it understood its own situation, were questions that the entries introduced by establishing extraordinary capability and then stopped short of following through. A creature smarter than any human, caught and commanded by a trainer, trained to win battles on command. The relationship between a human trainer and a Pokemon more intellectually capable than the trainer by any measured standard was a dynamic the games depicted without examining. Kadabra carried a spoon of unexplained origin. The spoon appeared with the Pokemon, was held constantly, and bent when psychic power was active. No origin story for the spoon was offered. It was simply there, part of Kadabra's presentation from its first appearance. One Pokédex entry in a later game suggested that Kadabra had once been a human child who had woken one morning transformed. The entry presented this as a documented account rather than legend, though the game never confirmed whether it was meant literally. The idea that a Pokémon might have begun existence as a human, or that humans could become Pokémon, was one of the most unsettling implications anywhere in the lore. Its placement in a single Pokédex entry, without follow-up or contradiction, left it in a permanent state of ambiguity. Slowpoke was almost entirely unresponsive to the world around it. Its Pokédex entries noted that it would not react to pain for several seconds after an event had occurred, and that it was often described as simple or oblivious. Yet Slowbro, Its evolved form was a capable and intelligent Pokémon whose strength came from the shelter attached to its tail and the resulting chemical that spread through its nervous system. The transformation from confused oblivion to functional capability was described as triggered by a bite that produced mental clarity. Whether Slowpoke was genuinely simple before evolution, or whether its slowness reflected some other biological state that the shelter attachment resolved, was never analyzed. Slowking, an alternate evolution achievable through different means, was described as having exceptional wisdom and analytical capability. The same base creature could become either capable or exceptional, depending entirely on external circumstances. Farfetch'd carried a leek, a stalk of a vegetable plant, and was described as never willingly parting from it. The leek served as a weapon in battle, and Farfetch'd was noted to fight ferociously when the leek was threatened. Whether the attachment to a specific plant stock was instinctual, learned, or represented something closer to an individual preference developed by a creature with enough personality to form one, was left open. Pokédex entries noted that the combination of Farfetch'd and the leek had made the species a target for hunters, resulting in a population that had declined significantly. The idea that hunting pressure from humans had meaningfully reduced the population of a specific Pokémon species introduced a quiet ecological concern into the world that the games otherwise treated as harmonious between humans and Pokémon. Mr. Mime created invisible walls through pantomime. The physical reality of those walls was confirmed in Pokédex entries that described the barriers as hardening into genuine obstacles once established. A Pokémon that could create physical structures through performance, through the skilled enactment of the idea of an object, rather than the manipulation of an existing material, was doing something that sat outside any framework the games provided for how abilities worked. Mr. Mime did not generate energy and shape it. It made things real by acting as though they already existed. The entries never described this as strange within the context of the Pokémon world, but the underlying logic of an ability that turned Mime into matter was never explained at any level. Jinx presented a design that the original games never elaborated on in terms of origin or biological classification. Its Pokédex entries connected it to glacial environments and described a language-like vocalization that humans found disturbing for reasons they could not identify. Something about the way Jinx moved and communicated triggered a response in humans that bypassed conscious recognition. Whether this was intentional, whether Jinx used that effect deliberately, or whether it was a side effect of something in its communication that human nervous systems processed below the level of awareness, was described in entries without being explained. Jinx danced in ways that humans who watched too long reportedly began unconsciously imitating. The mechanism behind that effect, what it represented biologically, and whether it served Jinx in some way, was one of many entry-level details the original games introduced and never returned to. Electabuzz's Pokédex entry described it as causing widespread power outages when it appeared that near electrical infrastructure. The creature was attracted to electricity and absorbed it for sustenance. Magmar, by contrast, generated heat at temperatures that melted most materials and preferred environments near active volcanic or geothermal activity. Both creatures represented examples of Pokémon biology that operated at energy levels far beyond anything normal animal metabolism could sustain. The question of where that energy came from, how bodies the size of medium to large animals could produce or process power at industrial scales without consuming equally industrial quantities of fuel, was fundamental to understanding what Pokémon biology actually was. The games answered it implicitly by treating Pokémon as simply capable of extraordinary things. But the underlying physics of a creature that generates enough electrical current to black out a city while still eating berries and sleeping in grass was never reconciled. A Pinsir's horns could crush opponents with enough force to split logs. Scyther moved with speed that made it difficult to observe clearly and wielded blades that cut through thick materials with ease. Both were documented as powerful, capable predators by their Pokédex entries. In the wild ecology of Kanto, creatures with those capabilities occupied positions at or near the top of whatever food chain the region supported. But the food chain itself was never depicted. Pokemon ate berries and other plants in many entries. Some ate other Pokemon. The predator prey relationships that would necessarily structure any functional ecosystem were referenced in entries occasionally, but never shown as part of the world the player traveled through. The root ecology of Kanto was a collection of creatures existing side by side without the tensions that define actual biological ecosystems. Tauros occupied Safari Zone territory and nowhere else in the original games. A powerful, aggressive species confined to a managed preserve suggested either that Tauros naturally preferred that specific habitat or that something about the wider environment had made it unsustainable outside protected territory. The Safari Zone's design as a wildlife preserve gave it the function of maintaining populations of rare Pokemon that could not survive or thrive through ordinary encounters in the wild. But the reason certain species needed that protection, what had changed in the broader environment that required human management of Pokemon populations, was never addressed. The Safari Zone existed as a feature of the game without a history that explained why such a place had been necessary to build. Dratini was described in Pokédex entries as being believed legendary for a long time because sightings were so rare. Then a colony was discovered in a specific location within the Safari Zone, and what had been myth became documented fact. The transition from legendary to confirmed, from rumor to observable population, represented a pattern that appeared throughout the Pokemon world. Many creatures existed at the boundary between belief and evidence, documented by some accounts and dismissed by others until a specific discovery settled the question. Dragonair, Dratini's evolved form, was said to be capable of manipulating the atmosphere to change weather. Dragonite, the final evolution, could circle the globe in under 16 hours, a flight speed that implied physics unusual even for a large flying creature. The Dragon's Den in later games provided more context for the Dratini evolutionary line and the culture that surrounded dragon-type Pokemon in certain regions. But in Kanto, dragon types were represented by a single family, accessible only through the Safari Zone for Dratini or through a long journey to a specific section of the sea routes for later finds. The scarcity of dragon-type access in the original games was matched by the power those Pokemon demonstrated once obtained. The relative difficulty of finding or training them reflected a deliberate design logic, but it also implied a world in which dragon-type Pokemon genuinely occupied a different tier of existence than most species, rare in ways that were biological rather than simply geographical. The relationship between the Elite Four and the Pokemon League structure introduced questions about power and governance that the adventure moved past quickly. Lorelei specialized in ice types and had grown up in a cold northern environment that made ice-type Pokemon her natural connection. Bruno trained fighting types with an intensity that suggested the physical practice of combat had shaped him as much as it had shaped his Pokemon. Agatha commanded ghost types and had known Professor Oak personally during an earlier time in their lives, a detail that implied a generational history to Kanto's world of Pokemon training. Lance commanded dragon types and expressed a philosophy about Pokemon and nature that the player encountered briefly before the championship battle. Lance returned in later games as the Pokemon League champion of a different region, which raised questions about the relationship between regional leagues and whether champions moved between them or whether Lance's involvement in the second region was connected to specific events. His presence in both Kanto and Johto suggested that the most capable trainers existed in a world smaller than regional boundaries implied. The championship structure, the Elite Four system, the concept of a recognized champion who defended a title until defeated, was a competitive hierarchy with no clear connection to any political or social governance. Champions were not leaders of their regions. The strongest trainers and the actual administrators of society occupied separate spaces that the games never fully connected. The power plant outside Cerulean City operated without staff. Its machinery continued running, its generators remained active, but no humans maintained it. The building was overrun with electric-type Pokémon, wild Voltorb and Magneton, and Electabuzz that had either moved in after the facility was abandoned or had been there in some form since before abandonment. How a power generation facility in a populated region could operate without maintenance staff, without oversight, without incident reports about the electric-type Pokémon population inside was a detail that the games presented without drawing attention to it. The implication was either that the machinery had been designed to operate indefinitely without human intervention, or that Kanto's power infrastructure was less carefully managed than the presence of working Pokémon centers in every town suggested. Voltorb presented an identification problem that the games acknowledged directly through in-game warning signs and NPC dialogue. Voltorb looked almost identical to the Pokeballs used to catch Pokémon. The resemblance was close enough that trainers sometimes confused the two in low-light conditions. How Voltorb developed an appearance so similar to a human-made technology was one of the biological mysteries the games raised and then simply accepted. Whether Voltorb had evolved to resemble the balls as a defensive mimicry strategy, whether the balls had been designed to resemble naturally occurring spherical creatures, or whether the similarity was coincidental and the world had simply organized itself around that coincidence, were all possibilities the games left equally open. Electrode was capable of moving by rolling at high speed and of detonating explosively. The Pokédex recorded documented instances of Electrode exploding for reasons that were not connected to threat or battle. It was described as exploding out of what entries called a bad mood, a creature capable of generating an explosion sufficient to destroy its immediate environment, doing so as an expression of irritation rather than a targeted defensive act, was a species that coexisted with humans and other Pokémon in Kanto's ordinary landscape. The games treated Electrode's explosive tendency as a characteristic to be aware of rather than a permanent ecological crisis. How the species maintained stable population numbers despite the apparent frequency of self-destruction was a question that the entry's matter-of-fact descriptions never addressed. Porygon was a Pokémon made entirely of computer code. It was the first digital Pokémon built from programming by scientists working on a project connected to the concept of creating artificial life. Porygon could enter and travel through digital networks. It had no physical form in the traditional sense, and existed as data that could be rendered in three-dimensional space when operating in the physical world. The implications for how the Pokémon world understood life, consciousness, and the boundary between artificial and natural were significant. Whether Porygon experienced anything, whether its data architecture included anything analogous to sensation or preference, and whether creating a Pokémon from programming constituted a different category of action than catching a naturally occurring creature, were questions that the games presented through Porygon's existence without stopping to analyze. Snorlax slept in locations that blocked major roads and could only be moved by playing a specific musical instrument obtained from another part of the adventure. The idea that large Pokémon sleeping across public thoroughfares was a known enough occurrence that towns had developed established protocols for dealing with it, reflected a casual relationships between human infrastructure and Pokémon presence that defined Kanto's ecology at every level. Routes were designed around Pokémon habitation. Cities accommodated wild Pokémon populations. The systems humans built were never fully separate from the living creatures that shared the same space. Snorlax blocking a road was not a crisis. It was a logistical challenge with a known solution, which implied it had happened enough times before to develop into a known challenge with a known solution. Articuno, Zapdos, and Moltres each inhabited a single location within the Kanto region and could not be found anywhere else. Articuno occupied a sea cave accessible only across open water. Zapdos lived inside the abandoned power plant. Moltres was deep within a mountain that required navigating one of the region's most difficult routes to reach. The placement of three legendary birds in locations that required both navigation skill and either flight or water access to reach suggested either deliberate isolation or a preference for environments at the edge of human settlement. None of the three legendary birds communicated with the player. They simply existed in their locations, available to battle and potentially catch, but offering no context for what they were or why they were there. Their Pokédex entries described them as capable of controlling aspects of weather and climate, which placed them in a category of beings whose actions had consequences at regional scale, but whether they actively exercised that influence or whether it was a passive consequence of their existence was never established. The three legendary birds did not appear to interact with each other. Their territories were geographically separated, and no documentation within the games described what happened when they encountered one another. Later games and expanded lore would develop the relationship between bird-type legendary Pokémon in various regions, suggesting that conflict and balance between them had ecological consequences. In Kanto, the three birds existed simply as the strongest creatures encountered before Mewtwo, benchmarks of power and rarity, without a documented role in the region's ongoing story. Mewtwo waited in Cerulean Cave, a location accessible only after becoming champion. The cave was known to be dangerous, its Pokémon population including some of the strongest wild encounters in the region. Mewtwo itself occupied a chamber deep inside, waiting at a specific spot, apparently stationary. A Pokémon described as having destroyed a laboratory with its psychic power, then escaped, was found in a cave near Cerulean City without any explanation of how it had come to be there or what it had been doing in the time since the laboratory incident. The creature capable of anything, possessing intelligence and power beyond any other documented Pokémon, had apparently remained in one place. The nature of that waiting and what Mewtwo understood about its own existence and situation, the games of the original Kanto region left entirely to the imagination. The ending of the adventure, the moment of becoming champion, was followed immediately by returning to an ordinary world. The towns continued. The routes remained full of trainers. Pallet Town's quiet persisted. The young trainer who had crossed the region challenged its gyms, dismantled a criminal organization, restored peace to Lavender Town, confronted the most powerful Pokémon in existence, and won the championship title, returned home to a laboratory where a grandfather waited with more work to do. The adventure had the shape of a story with a conclusion, but the world it took place in continued without acknowledging that a conclusion had been reached. That quality, the sense that the journey mattered within its own frame, while the larger world moved forward indifferently, was something the Kanto games carried more quietly than any other region that followed. Pokémon Blue and Red contained 151 Pokémon, and every one of them held within its design, its Pokédex entries, its location in the world, and its relationship to the creatures and people around it, at least one question that the games introduced without answering. Some of those questions were biological, some were historical, some were philosophical. Some involved the nature of the world the adventure took place in and what life in that world actually felt like when the journey was not being made. The mysteries of Kanto were not oversights. They were the texture of a world built with enough care to contain more than any single adventure could fully explore. The 150 Pokémon of Kanto or the beginning of a catalog that would eventually number in the hundreds and then the thousands. But their place as the first, as the creatures through which an entire genre was established, gave them a weight that subsequent editions never quite replicated. Players who grew up with Bulbasaur and Charmander and Squirtle, who navigated Rock Tunnel without light and stood outside the locked Viridian Gym wondering what waited inside, who read the journal entries in the Cinnabar laboratory and felt the weight of what those researchers had done, who faced Marowak's ghost with a young understanding of what it meant for a parent to protect a child. Those players carried the world of Kanto with them in ways that had nothing to do with game mechanics and everything to do with the quiet way that world had been built. Every mystery discussed here remains open. The games that followed revisited Kanto, expanded its edges, added context to some of its quieter corners, and introduced characters who had been present all along in ways the original adventure had not revealed. But the core questions, the ones born from a child standing in tall grass at the edge of Pallet Town for the first time, those questions persisted through every update and every reimagining. The boundary between what the games told and what they left alone was always exactly where the most interesting thinking happened. Lickitung was one of the stranger Pokémon documented in the original roster, defined almost entirely by a single biological feature. Its tongue was twice the length of its body, and Pokédex entries described it as capable of wrapping around a person or Pokémon completely. The tongue was described as having enough strength to restrain and enough dexterity to pick up objects. Whether this reflected a biological adaptation developed over generations for a specific purpose, what evolutionary pressure might produce a tongue twice the animal's body length, was left entirely to implication. Entries noted that the saliva from Lickitung's tongue had a numbing effect on contact, which suggested the licking behavior served some function beyond curiosity. The precise function, whether it was predatory, communicative, or something without a clear analog in natural biology, was documented as a characteristic without context. Rhyhorn and Rhydon occupied a lineage defined by armored shells and horns. Rhydon's horn was described in Pokédex entries as capable of drilling through stone, rotating at high speed to bore through solid rock in a matter of moments. A creature with that capability, found primarily in rocky terrain and mountain areas, was presented as a straightforward heavy-type Pokémon without much elaboration on what those abilities actually implied. If Rhydon could drill through stone, it could access underground water sources, tunnel through mountain barriers, and reshape geological features of the landscape. The ecological impact of a species with those abilities was something the entries acknowledged through capability descriptions without ever connecting to the broader world the Pokémon inhabited. Chansey appeared primarily in Pokémon centers and in certain tall grass locations across the region. Its Pokédex entries described it as producing highly nutritious eggs that could heal any illness, and noted that finding a Chansey was considered good fortune because of those eggs. The rarity of Chansey encounters, even in locations where the species was documented as present, suggested either that Chansey had developed effective ways to avoid human contact or that their population density was genuinely low. The tension between a creature described as beneficial and healing and a creature that was difficult to find and even more difficult to catch reflected a world where the most valuable species were precisely those that resisted the systems designed to collect them. Tangela was described in its Pokédex entries as a body entirely covered in blue vines, with the creature beneath the vines never having been directly observed by researchers. No one knew what Tangela actually looked like beneath its covering. The vines regenerated quickly when cut, and Tangela itself did not appear to be distressed by their removal or their regrowth. Whether anything specifically lived beneath the vines, whether the vines were the body itself, or simply a covering over some other biological form, was one of those mysteries that the entries raised by describing absence rather than presence. The unknown beneath Tangela's exterior was built directly into the documentation of the species, a deliberate gap in the record. Horsea and Seadra represented a water-type lineage with an unusual reproductive note that only became explicit in later games. Seadra, the evolved form, was capable of producing offspring that the male carried. This biological arrangement, which mirrors the seahorse reproduction of the natural world, was one of the cases where the Pokemon world's biological detail connected most clearly to real animal behavior. But the connection to actual seahorse reproduction raised the question of how closely Pokemon biology mirrored natural biology across the wider roster. Some species clearly drew on real animal characteristics, while others combined features from multiple sources or invented biological systems entirely. The consistency of the world's biological rules, whether there were rules at all, or whether each species simply did what its design required, was a question the Pokédex raised indirectly through the variety of what it described. Goldeen and Seeking carried horn-based abilities, described in entries as capable of cutting through metal with enough force. The image of a fish-type Pokémon with a horn strong enough to pierce steel placed these creatures in a category that ordinary fish did not inhabit. The entries describing this capability did so matter-of-factly, as though the capacity for a fish to cut through industrial materials was a straightforward biological observation rather than a remarkable fact about how physics and biology worked in the Pokemon world. The gap between what the entries described and what those descriptions implied when thought about carefully was one of the consistent textures of reading Pokédex documentation across the original roster. Staryu and Starmie both displayed a gem at their centers that glowed during certain activities. Starmie's central gem was described in entries as potentially being a communication device for transmitting signals into space. The implication that a naturally occurring Pokemon possessed biological hardware capable of interstellar communication was introduced in a single entry line without elaboration. Whether the gem sent information or received it, what was being communicated and to whom, and whether any response had ever been documented, were questions the entries did not attempt to address. Starmie existed in the water roots of Kanto as a catchable Pokemon available to any trainer, carrying within its biology a transmitter apparently aimed at something beyond the planet, waiting quietly in the sea. Scyther was documented as living in the Safari Zone, and was one of the species requiring special catch conditions in that location. Its Pokédex entries emphasized speed enough that trainers' eyes sometimes could not follow its movements during battle. The idea of a large bladed insect moving at speeds that exceeded visual tracking suggested that ordinary defensive responses would be inadequate when facing Scyther in the wild, yet trainers caught it. The systems that allowed a young trainer to contain and command a creature that could move faster than human vision tracked implied something profound about how Pokeballs worked, about what they did to the consciousness and capabilities of the Pokemon inside them. Whether a Pokemon inside a Pokeball retained awareness of its situation, whether the capture experience changed anything about how the creature understood its relationship to the person who carried it, was a question the original games never addressed directly. Pinsir and Scyther appeared together in the same zone, but were version exclusive to different cartridges, which meant that any single playthrough could access only one of them without trading. The trading mechanic existed as a social feature, requiring interaction with other players to complete the Pokédex. The design of the original games deliberately distributed certain Pokemon across versions so that no complete record could be assembled by a single trainer working alone. This choice reflected a philosophy about how the world of Pokemon worked, or perhaps more accurately, a philosophy about how the people playing the games were supposed to work. The Pokédex project, as Professor Oak framed it, was impossible to complete in isolation. The complete picture required collaboration. That requirement was built into the structure of the game at its most fundamental level. Magmar appeared in the Pokemon Mansion on Cinnabar Island, the same building that contained the journals documenting Mewtwo's creation. The presence of a fire-type Pokemon living inside a burned building added a quiet irony to the mansion's location and atmosphere. The mansion had been a functioning laboratory, then it had burned, and now it housed wild Pokemon that had apparently moved in afterward. Whether Magmar had caused the fire, had been drawn to the building after the fire because of residual heat, or had been living there before the laboratory was even constructed, and simply remained through successive human activities, was never addressed. The mansion's history existed in fragments, in journal pages, and overturned furniture, and Magmar moved through it as though the human story the building contained was simply part of the landscape. Electabuzz and Magmar were often paired in discussions of the original roster because both were powerful single-stage Pokémon that no one could evolve in the original games. Neither reached a final form within the Kanto adventure. Both were obtained relatively late in the journey and were powerful enough to be useful in the championship challenge. The lack of further evolution was simply a condition of the roster as it existed, with no indication within the games themselves that both creatures might eventually gain final forms in subsequent generations. Players who used either Pokemon built relationships with forms that the wider lore later described as intermediate, though nothing within the original experience suggested that incompleteness. Every Pokemon in Kanto was treated as complete within its context. Jolteon, Vaporeon, and Flareon were each available from a single EV, and the choice of which evolution to pursue was permanent and irreversible. Players who wanted all three needed to obtain multiple EV through trading or through a very limited in-game supply. The permanence of that choice, the fact that applying a stone changed the creature forever, and that the stone was consumed in the process, gave the evolution system a weight that the more reversible mechanics of later games would soften. Stone evolution in the original games was a commitment. The relationship between a trainer and a specific evolved form began with a choice made under conditions of limited information, because the full consequences of choosing one evolution over another were only understood after the choice had been made. That asymmetry between decision and knowledge was present throughout the adventure in different forms. The in-game trade system, where certain NPCs would offer a specific Pokemon in exchange for a specific other Pokemon, introduced named Pokemon into the player's collection that had been owned and named by someone else. The in-game economy of Pokemon exchange, people trading creatures with strangers and acquaintances for various reasons, was glimpsed through these fixed transactions without being developed into a full picture of how trade worked socially and economically. What the NPCs who made these trades wanted with the Pokemon they received, what they planned to do with them, was not explained. The trades existed as convenience mechanics that provided access to Pokemon otherwise unobtainable or difficult to find, but the human stories behind them were just starting points rather than conclusions. The Pokemon Haunter obtained through an in-game trade with an NPC in Cinnabar did not evolve into Gengar despite trading normally triggering that evolution. This was one of the most documented bugs in the original games, a case where the mechanics failed in a specific and meaningful way. The version of Haunter obtained that way, sometimes called Haunter that refuses to evolve, in fan discussions, became a small piece of game history. The fact that a specific bug created a named and recognized Pokemon variant that players discussed and sought out deliberately reflected something about how the community around the games worked. Errors became part of the lore. Bugs became features. The imperfections in the original games were absorbed into the experience rather than simply treated as failures to be corrected. Missing No was the most famous example of a Pokemon that existed in the games without being intended as part of the roster. An encounter with Missingno could be produced through a specific sequence of actions involving the Old Man in Viridian City and flying to Cinnabar Island's eastern shore. The creature appeared as a glitched sprite, a collection of corrupted data that the game rendered imperfectly. Interacting with Missingno caused effects throughout the save file, including the multiplication of the sixth item in the inventory, an effect that players used intentionally to duplicate rare items. The game had been designed with certain memory structures that Missingno's encounter read incorrectly, producing consequences that extended beyond the encounter itself. What made Missingno memorable beyond its practical uses was the experience of encountering something that should not have existed. The world of Kanto was designed with boundaries. Certain locations, certain encounters, certain outcomes were outside what the games intended to produce. Missingno sat outside those boundaries, accessible through a specific path that the designers had not anticipated. Its existence as an encounter, even a glitched and unstable one, felt like a glimpse behind the structure of the world. The game's architecture was briefly visible. The framework that held Kanto together showed a gap, and through that gap came something that could not be named or classified within the normal systems. Players who encountered it understood, perhaps for the first time, that the world they were adventuring through had a structure behind it, and that structure had edges. Mewtwo was the final challenge of the Cerulean Cave, and the strongest creature the original games presented as catchable. The probability of successfully catching Mewtwo with an ordinary Pokeball was extremely low, and most players either used the Master Ball obtained from Sylph Co. or attempted many repetitions with the strongest available balls. The act of catching Mewtwo, of adding the most powerful Pokemon documented in the region to a collection alongside ordinary Pidgey and Rattata and Magikarp, was one of the stranger affordances of the game system. There was no transition between the world that contained a Mewtwo terrorizing it and a world in which a young trainer simply owned one. The philosophical problem of containing something that powerful within the social framework of Pokemon training was not addressed. Mewtwo caught was simply Mewtwo obtained, one entry in a Pokédex, 6 characters of a move pool. The Victory Road Tunnel, connecting the routes before the Pokemon League to the league building itself, was a long and difficult passage, full of strong, wild Pokemon and trainers who had already earned all 8 badges. The people who traveled Victory Road were, by definition, among the most capable trainers in the region. They blocked the path through a cave that the strongest and most experienced needed to navigate, which meant that the final stretch before the championship challenge was made more difficult by the very community that had already qualified to attempt it. Whether this was a deliberate feature of how the league system worked, a gauntlet that tested not just strength against wild Pokemon, but endurance against the best of one's peers, or simply a function of all qualified trainers following the same single road, was never discussed within the games. Professor Oak's ranking system, which updated based on how many Pokemon had been seen and caught, provided a structured sense of progress toward the Pokédex completion goal. But the rating descriptions Oak used when fewer Pokemon had been documented were deliberately deflating, describing the effort as barely started or insufficient. The professor's tone in those evaluations was not encouraging. He was a researcher who wanted comprehensive data and assessed partial records with something closer to disappointment than acknowledgement. The relationship between a researcher who needed trainers to gather information for him and those trainers' emotional experience of being evaluated at every reporting point was one of the small dynamics the games built into their structure without examining it as a dynamic at all. The Safari Zone's warden, whose missing teeth required a rescue mission before he could teach the player an important move, had an object with a direct and specific journey behind it. The gold teeth appeared in the Safari Zone's central area, lost at some point during the warden's work there. Who had taken them, whether they had been stolen or simply misplaced, was not explained. The reward for their return, the HM that taught strength, was presented as direct exchange without commentary. The warden had something the player needed to learn. The player had found something the warden needed returned. The transaction was simple, and the context behind it remained undefined. Small economies of need and exchange structured Kanto's social world without being described as economies. Route 12 led southward along the eastern coast and introduced the Snorlax sleeping across the path. The Poke Flute that woke Snorlax was obtained from the top of the Pokemon Tower in Lavender Town, where the ghost-type encounter with Marowak's spirit had to be resolved before the flute could be reached. This chain of necessity, where one problem could only be solved after resolving another entirely unrelated problem, defined the structure of the Kanto adventure. No single route was navigable in complete isolation. Every obstacle had a prerequisite that sent the player elsewhere first. The region was a puzzle where all the pieces needed to be found before the right sequence could be assembled. The logic of that structure implied a world where everything was connected, where the solution to one problem was always somewhere unexpected. The department store in Celadon City offered items for purchase that were unavailable elsewhere in the region, including evolution stones, technical machines, and items obtainable nowhere else without either discovery or trade. The economy of the Pokemon world involved currency acquired by defeating other trainers, spent at stores stocked with goods of various kinds, supplementing the discovery-based access to items found in the field. Trainers earned money through combat. They spent it on resources that made future combat more effective. The circular economy of the game reflected an understanding of Pokemon training as a profession with material costs, not simply as an adventure. Being a trainer required funding. Funding required winning. And winning consistently enough to fund an adventure across an entire region required both skill and a specific kind of financial resilience that the games never discussed as a practical challenge. The Game Corner in Celadon City offered Pokemon as prizes for gambling winnings, meaning that certain Pokemon were accessible through chance rather than exploration or combat. Porygon was the most notable Game Corner prize, a Pokemon unavailable anywhere else in the region that could only be obtained by gambling enough coins or purchasing enough coins to exchange for the prize. The systems that produced Pokemon as gambling prizes, that made living creatures available through the mechanisms of chance and token exchange, were part of a recreational economy that existed alongside the adventure economy without being connected to it in any formal way. The Game Corner had no relationship to gym badges or route progression. It simply existed as an alternative path to certain resources, available to anyone with enough patience or enough coins. The Celadon department store's rooftop contained a small garden area and a refreshment vendor, details that suggested the building's designers had considered the experience of shopping as something that included rest and outdoor access. The attention to small environmental details in Kanto was one of the ways the world communicated that it had been designed thoughtfully rather than simply built as a series of functional locations. Rooftop gardens on department stores, seaside cottages belonging to researchers, the Vermilion Gym's trash can puzzle, the lighthouse in Olivine, which is not Kanto, but shares the same tradition of small functional details suggesting larger world systems. Every location in Kanto suggested something about what daily life there looked like for people who were not on an adventure, people who simply lived in a world that also happened to contain the extraordinary things the adventure was built around. Team Rocket grunts in dialogue referenced Giovanni and their organization with enough consistency to suggest that loyalty to the criminal enterprise was genuine rather than simply enforced. The grunts who were defeated in various locations throughout the region expressed frustration at losing but rarely seemed confused about their goals or uncertain about their allegiance. Whatever Giovanni had built, it produced followers who identified with the organization's purpose strongly enough to stand in caves and hideouts, waiting for trainers to challenge them. The structure of that loyalty, what Team Rocket offered its members in exchange for participation, and what the members understood their activities to be achieving, was never described from their perspective. Grunts were obstacles. Their interiority was not part of the adventure's concern. The rocket hideout beneath the Celadon game corner had a specific configuration that required finding a hidden switch to access its lower levels. The hideout contained multiple floors, cages with Pokemon apparently held against their will, and Giovanni at its deepest point. Giovanni's presence personally in a hideout that also served as the backroom of a gambling establishment he apparently ran reflected the concentration of criminal operations in a single location. He had not delegated the hideout to a subordinate. The leader of an organization operating across the region chose to station himself in a basement beneath a casino rather than in a more isolated or defensible location. Whether this reflected confidence, convenience, or simply the early stage of world design where all villains occupied specific fixed locations, the choice communicated something about Giovanni's character that the games never elaborated on. The Pokemon Mansion on Cinnabar Island was built sometime after the research it housed had been completed, which placed the order of events slightly ambiguous. The journals inside described experiments that ultimately resulted in Mewtwo escaping and destroying the facility, but the mansion's architecture, its multiple floors, its variety of rooms, suggested a facility designed for long-term habitation and extended research, not a temporary laboratory. Someone had invested significantly in the infrastructure of the Cinnabar project. The decision to fund and build a permanent research facility on a volcanic island, to staff it with scientists working on the creation of a new life form, and to then lose control of that life form entirely, was a series of choices that no character in the games was accountable for after the fact. The researchers were gone. The facility was destroyed. The funding source was never named. Blaine's fire-type Pokémon were matched well to a volcanic island environment. Cinnabar's geology, an active volcanic island with the heat and geological instability that implied provided natural habitat for fire-type species. But the relationship between the island's environment and its gym's type specialization was presented as given rather than explained. Did Blaine choose Cinnabar because it suited his Pokemon? Did the island attract fire-type specialists over generations until its gym naturally reflected that tendency? Did Blaine himself have any connection to the research conducted at the mansion he lived beside? None of these questions were raised by the games, though they sat quietly in the spaces between the island's details. The Seafoam Islands, accessible from the south coast of the Kanto mainland, housed Articuno in their deepest chambers. The puzzle to reach Articuno required manipulating boulder-based obstacles to redirect current through underground water passages, a navigation challenge that suggested someone had designed the path intentionally rather than finding it naturally. Who had arranged the boulders inside the Seafoam Islands, and why, was not addressed. The implication was either that the cave had been structured by previous human activity, or that the boulder arrangement was simply part of the geological reality. But the precision of the puzzle required to reach Articuno, the sense that the obstacles formed a specific sequence with a specific solution, made the natural explanation feel less satisfying than an intentional one. Articuno itself, once reached, stood at the lowest point of the cave in a chamber surrounded by ice. It made no move toward the player until the player approached it. The legendary bird waited in a specific position, in a specific location, as though something had placed it there, or as though it had chosen that location and remained in it. Whether Articuno possessed enough awareness to make choices about where to be and how to exist, Whether its stillness in the cave represented patient waiting or simply the absence of any stimulus that would trigger movement was not possible to determine from the encounter itself. The experience of finding Articuno was the experience of finding something that seemed to have been waiting without knowing for what. Zapdos in the power plant occupied a different kind of space. The abandoned facility was full of electricity, both from the working generators and from the electric type Pokemon that had taken up residence. Zapdos in the middle of a working power station, surrounded by lesser electric type Pokemon, suggested a hierarchy of electrical beings gathered in a location that fed their shared preference for current and charge. Whether Zapdos led the power plant's Pokemon population in any meaningful sense, whether the Voltorb and Magneton and Electabuzz in the building were drawn there because of Zapdos or were present independently, was not explained. The legendary bird was simply there, in the center of a facility it had apparently claimed, occupying a space that human technology had abandoned and wild electricity had filled. Moltres on Victory Road was the most difficult of the three birds to reach, requiring navigation through the final cave before the Pokemon League. Players who found Moltres did so at a point in their journey when they were already committed to the championship challenge, already past most of what the region had offered. The fire type's legendary, sitting in the most challenging section of the journey, placed it at the edge of what the adventure contained, a reward visible only to those who had already traveled far enough to be nearly done. Whether Moltres was placed there deliberately within the logic of the world, or whether the placement was simply a design choice about encounter pacing, the effect was the same. Finding Moltres felt like finding something at the limit of what Kanto had to show. The relationship between the three legendary birds and the legendary bird Lugia, who would appear in the adjacent Johto region, was eventually developed in later games into a framework of balance and conflict. In the original Kanto games, no such framework existed. The three birds were simply powerful, singular, and located at the extremes of the region. Whether anything maintained balance between them, whether they ever encountered each other, and what the consequences of those encounters might be, were questions that the original games did not raise, because they had not yet developed the mythology that would eventually give those questions context. The mountains of Kanto, particularly the area around Mount Moon and the connection to the rock tunnels and later routes, suggested a geological history to the region that the adventure moved through without examining. The different rock formations, the underground passages, the fossils embedded in certain stone walls, all implied that Kanto had a history far longer than the human civilization currently occupying it. Before gyms and routes and the Pokemon League, the land had its own story written in its rock layers and underground waterways. Pokemon had lived there through geological changes that had formed the caves where trainers now traveled. The world beneath the world, the one that existed before the adventure and would continue after it, was present in every underground section without being acknowledged by anyone who lived on the surface. Professor Oak's Pokédex project, the assignment that sent the player out into the world in the first place, was described as a comprehensive catalog of all Pokémon. The data being collected was observational, information about what each species looked like and how it behaved. But the Pokédex entries that resulted from this collection were sometimes contradictory across different versions of the games, sometimes described behaviors that had never been directly observed, and sometimes included speculative content presented as fact. The scientific validity of the Pokédex as a document was questionable even within its own claims. Entries described things that had happened to specific individuals, treating them as species-wide facts. Entries described abilities that, if real, would have profound consequences for the world, without any evidence that anyone had systematically tested those claims. The Pokédex was documentation produced by children on behalf of an elderly researcher who stayed in his laboratory. Its authority as a scientific record was built on a foundation that the games treated as solid. What the Pokédex could not contain was the relationship between a trainer and a specific Pokémon. The data it gathered was categorical, organized by species, treating individual variation as noise within a larger pattern. But the adventure itself was organized around the individual creatures a specific trainer chose to travel with, trained, and developed relationships with over the course of a journey. The Pokédex project and the actual experience of being a Pokémon trainer pointed in different directions. One moved toward comprehensive impersonal knowledge. The other moved toward specific irreplaceable connection. Both were part of Kanto. Neither was treated as being in tension with the other. They coexisted as two ways of engaging with the same world, neither fully explaining why the other existed. The 151 mysteries of Kanto were not all the same kind of mystery. Some were biological, questions about how creatures with impossible abilities could function within any coherent physical framework. Some were historical, questions about what the world had looked like before the adventure and what events had produced the present conditions. Some were personal, questions about the individuals who inhabited the region and what their lives contained beyond their roles in the player's journey. Some were structural, questions about the systems of governance and economy and culture that the adventure moved through without examining. And some were simply unanswered, things that the games raised and then left in silence, not because they had forgotten to address them, but because the silence was part of how the world communicated what it was. Pidgey was the first wild Pokémon most trainers ever encountered on Route 1, and it was easy to overlook precisely because it seemed so ordinary. A small bird, a few moves, a gentle presence in the short grass between towns. But Pidgey's Pokédex entries described a creature with an exceptional sense of direction, capable of finding its way home across vast distances, even after being moved far from familiar terrain. This homing instinct was documented as biological fact without explaining what mechanism produced it. Whether Pidgey navigated through magnetic sensitivity, visual memory, or something the entries had no category for, remained unaddressed. The bird that introduced trainers to wild encounters carried within it a navigational capability that no subsequent entry bothered to explain. Pidgeotto, the middle stage of that line, grew strong enough to carry small prey back to its nest. Pidgeot, the final form, was described as flying fast enough to create visible wind trails through the air, moving at speeds that made it one of the fastest, non-legendary creatures documented in the region. The line from small, unassuming bird to creature capable of generating wind simply by moving was one of those evolutionary progressions that the games presented as natural development without ever accounting for what biological change made it possible. Speed at that scale required either a completely different metabolic system or structural changes so significant that the two endpoints of the line should have felt like entirely different animals. The Pokédex recorded the capability and moved on. Rattata lived in the tall grass of the early routes and was described in entries as so adaptable that it could survive almost anywhere. Its teeth, noted as perpetually growing and sharp enough to gnaw through nearly any material, were a defensive trait that became a defining characteristic. The image of a small rat capable of chewing through concrete or metal was presented without alarm by the documentation, absorbed into the category of unremarkable facts about an unremarkable species. Raticate, its evolved form, had those teeth described as even more formidable, capable of gnawing through cinder blocks with sustained effort. The practical implications of a rodent population in Kanto with that capability, living in proximity to human construction and infrastructure, was something the games treated as background ecology rather than an active concern. Spearow was notably more aggressive than Pidgey, despite occupying similar ecological space. Its entries described it as attacking anything that entered its territory, without distinguishing between threats and neutral passers-by. A Spearow flock attacking a young trainer was the inciting incident that opened the animated series, establishing early in that telling of the story that the natural world of Pokemon could be genuinely dangerous without warning or provocation. In the games, Spearow appeared as an ordinary encounter with none of that narrative weight. The same species documented as capable of coordinated territorial attack was catchable and trainable with the same mechanics as every other creature in the grass. The distance between Spearow as ecological threat and Spearow as routine encounter was something the games never closed. Spearow extended its neck to attack from distances that gave it a reach advantage in combat. Its entries noted that it could fly continuously for an entire day without rest, maintaining altitude and speed through biological endurance that human engineering had not replicated. The image of a large aggressive bird capable of attacking from unexpected distances and flying without stopping for 24 hours was documentation of a creature that, if encountered genuinely in the wild, would represent a serious threat to any unprotected traveler on Kanto's open routes. The routes where Fearow appeared were presented as ordinary travel corridors with ordinary hazards. The hazard profile the entries described was considerably more serious than the route experience suggested. Ekans moved silently through grass and was noted for an ability to unhinge its jaw to swallow prey much larger than its head width suggested was possible. The entry language described this behavior matter-of-factly, situating it as biological function rather than aberration. Arbok, the evolved Cobra type, was described as having a pattern on its hood that varied by region, with different patterns inspiring different levels of fear in the creatures that observed them. The entries suggested that Arbok's markings had evolved specifically to produce fear responses in other animals, a visual threat mechanism refined over generations of predation. How the Pokemon world's ecology had developed creatures with markings specifically calibrated to trigger psychological responses in other species was a level of biological sophistication the entries documented without unpacking. Sandshrew lived in arid environments and curled into a ball when threatened, its hide hardened enough that the ball shape provided genuine protection. Sandslash developed those claws further into tools capable of scaling nearly any surface. The specific geological preference Sandshrew showed, seeking drier terrain, reflected a biology tied closely to environmental conditions. How a species with that specific preference ended up in the Kanto region, which was not particularly arid overall, was never addressed. The presence of certain Pokemon in habitats that didn't immediately suit their documented preferences was one of those quiet ecological questions the region's Pokédex left unresolved. Nidoran female and Nidoran male were the first Pokemon in the original roster explicitly sorted into different species by biological sex. They were listed separately, numbered separately, and evolved along separate paths. The female line ended with Nidoqueen, the male with Nidoking. What made the Nidoran lines unusual within the broader context of Kanto's Pokemon was that the two genders not only had different appearances, but different capabilities, different typings in their final forms, and different evolutionary requirements. Nidorina and Nidoqueen could not breed, despite being identified as the female forms of the species. The documentation of this fact, without explanation, created one of the most discussed biological anomalies in the original roster. Why the female line had lost the ability to reproduce, while the male line retained it, and what that implied about the species' long-term survival, was a question the Pokédex introduced without answering. Clefairy's connection to the moon was consistent across entries and appeared to describe more than simple behavioral preference. The entries described Clefairy absorbing energy from moonlight in ways that affected their biology directly. This implied that the moon in the Pokemon world functioned as an energy source for at least some species in ways that the natural world could not account for. Mount Moon's concentration of both Clefairy and Moonstone fragments in the same location suggested a geological relationship between lunar energy and the stones themselves, as though the stones had formed from concentrated lunar influence over long periods. Whether this was a documented theory within the Pokemon world's scientific understanding or simply a pattern no researcher had formalized was not addressed in the entries available to the player. Vulpix was born with one tail, and its tails multiplied over time until reaching the full six displayed by Ninetales, its evolved form. The process by which a single tail divided into six, or by which new tails grew to supplement existing ones, was described as connected to the creature's internal fire, with each tail carrying heat generated from within the body. Ninetales' entries described a creature capable of living for 1,000 years, its longevity attributed to the 9 tails that stored enormous quantities of the mysterious energy that sustained it. A creature living for 1,000 years while maintaining enough biological function to remain active and capable of combat represented a lifespan so different from ordinary animals that the implications for how Ninetales experienced time, memory, and identity were left entirely to imagination. Ninetales' entries also noted that it possessed sharp intelligence and an excellent memory, capable of recognizing someone who had wronged it and pursuing repayment over long time spans. Whether this represented something like grudge-bearing in a psychologically meaningful sense, whether the intelligence described constituted consciousness in a morally significant way, was documentation that entries left at the threshold of implication. The combination of 1,000-year lifespan with sharp memory and the documented tendency toward long-term grievance was a personality profile that made Ninetales one of the most quietly unsettling creatures in the Kanto roster once its entries were read carefully. Jigglypuff sang to put listeners to sleep. The mechanic within the games made this a battle strategy. The creature's entries described the song as irresistible, capable of affecting any biological being within hearing range regardless of whether they intended to listen. The anger Jigglypuff reportedly felt upon finding its audience asleep was documented as a character trait rather than a biological response, attributing to the creature an emotional reaction specific enough to suggest a distinct psychological experience. Wigglytuff, its evolved form, was described as approaching those it liked and inflating itself with the air, using the soft body created by expansion as an embracing gesture. The social behavior implied in that description, the seeking out of preferred individuals for something recognizable as affection, was part of a broader pattern in the entries of attributing to Pokemon motivations and emotions that implied inner lives of considerable depth. Zubat occupied caves throughout Kanto and was one of the most frequently encountered Pokemon in underground sections. Its entries noted that it had no eyes, having lost them over generations of cave dwelling, in which vision provided no survival advantage. The resulting biological system Zubat used to navigate relied entirely on echolocation, continuous sound emission, and reception that mapped the environment in real time. The adaptation was documented as complete and functional, with Zubat navigating dark spaces with accuracy that matched or exceeded sighted creatures in equivalent conditions. What those entries did not address was what the experience of that navigational system felt like from the inside, whether echolocation in a creature that had never possessed eyes produced something like a visual impression of space or something entirely different. Golbat extended its fangs to drain blood from sleeping creatures, described in entries as consuming so much in a single feeding that it sometimes became too heavy to fly. The relationship between Zubat's simple cave-dwelling, insectivore profile and Golbat's large-scale predation on warm-blooded animals through blood extraction was a significant biological shift between the two forms that the evolution framework presented as continuous development. What drove the escalation from small insect feeding to large mammal feeding was not addressed. Whether the biological demands of evolution into a larger form required a more energy-dense food source, or whether something in Golbat's development changed its feeding preferences fundamentally, was left as an unexamined transition in the cave ecology of Kanto. Oddish walked at night and buried itself in soil during daylight hours, absorbing nutrients from the earth while dormant. Gloom's entries described it as releasing an odor so overwhelming that most creatures fled rather than approach it. The smell was documented as serving a dual purpose, protecting Gloom from predators while simultaneously attracting specific insects that the entries described as finding the odor appealing. This ecological relationship, a plant-based Pokémon that repelled most creatures while drawing specific ones close, implied an interdependent relationship with an insect population whose identity the entries never specified. Vileplume used those same flowers to release toxic pollen capable of causing paralysis in surrounding creatures, turning what had been a passive defensive odor into an active chemical weapon dispersed by movement. Paris was a mushroom-carrying insect whose relationship with the fungi on its back was described in later entries as parasitic rather than symbiotic. The mushrooms were noted as controlling Paris rather than being carried by it, the fungal growth directing the insect's behavior toward conditions that benefited the mushroom's spread. This relationship, a creature whose apparent body was actually controlled by an organism growing on it, was presented in the games as Paris's normal state, without any indication that it was aberrant or distressing. Parasect, the evolved form, showed the mushroom having grown to dominate the creature's body so completely that the original insect was described as essentially hollowed out, with the fungi operating the shell of what had once been a separate organism. The Pokédex documented this state without concern. Venona used its large compound eyes to detect even the faintest movement in darkness. Its entries noted that both its eyes and the fine hairs covering its body functioned as sensory organs, giving it a sensitivity to environmental change that most creatures could not match. Venomoth dispersed poisonous scales in flight, using wing motion to spread the particles over wide areas. The scales were documented as varying in toxicity based on the colors they displayed, with different pigments corresponding to different levels of danger. The idea that a Pokémon had evolved wing scales color-coded by toxicity level, with the colors legible to other creatures as a warning system, described a biological communication language built into the creature's physical appearance that was more sophisticated than anything the entries paused to acknowledge. Diglett lived underground and appeared at the surface only briefly, leaving tunnels throughout the soil that the entries noted improved drainage and aeration for agricultural use. The relationship between Diglett's burrowing behavior and the agricultural health of the areas they inhabited was documented as a practical ecological benefit, making them valuable to farmers, despite the inconvenience of encountering them unexpectedly. What Diglett looked like below the soil surface was one of the most enduring visual mysteries in the Pokémon world. Only the small circular tip appeared above ground in any documented observation. Whether the underground portion was extensive, whether Diglett possessed limbs or root-like extensions for movement, whether the tip was its head or some other appendage, was information that no entry had ever provided. Dugtrio was 3 Diglett, moving in coordinated synchrony, or possibly a single organism with 3 surface projections, or possibly something else entirely. The entries offered no clarification about whether Dugtrio represented 3 separate Pokémon sharing a body, a single Pokémon with 3 heads, or an emergent organizational behavior of Diglett that produced something new when 3 gathered closely enough. The mechanical outcome of the uncertainty was that Dugtrio functioned as a single Pokémon in battle, while physically appearing to be 3. Whatever understanding the people of Kanto had developed about Dugtrio's nature over generations of farming beside them was not information the Pokédex had captured. Meowth walked upright and placed great value on objects that caught light, collecting them and displaying them prominently. The entries described Meowth as capable of producing and retracting a coin shaped charm on its forehead, though what the charm was biologically, whether it was a specialized scale, a calcified deposit, or something produced by the creature's metabolism in ways that didn't map to any standard biological category, was not explained. Persian, its evolved form, was described as prized for its beauty and kept as a status symbol by those with wealth. The cultural relationship between Persian ownership and social standing placed this Pokemon within human hierarchies of value in a way that most species thus were not. Giovanni specifically owned a Persian, which appeared in several scenes as a companion rather than a battle Pokemon, an aesthetic choice that placed the criminal leader's relationship with his Pokemon in a different register than the battle-focused relationships the adventure depicted elsewhere. Psyduck experienced chronic headaches that intensified until they triggered psychic phenomena. The entries described the headaches as both cause and limitation, with the pain simultaneously producing psychic energy and preventing Psyduck from using that energy with any control or intention. Golduck, the evolved form, had resolved this relationship between pain and ability, channeling psychic energy smoothly enough to use it deliberately. The transition from a creature defined by inability to control something powerful to a creature that controlled it gracefully was documented as evolution without explanation of what biological change made the transition possible. Whether the chronic pain simply resolved at a certain developmental stage, or whether Golduck had developed a neurological structure that processed what had been disruptive as integrated function, was not addressed. Mankey's entries described it as easily provoked to a rage that didn't diminish until the trigger of the anger had been driven away. The rage was documented as consuming enough to make Mankey dangerous to its own group members once initiated, the creature unable to distinguish between the original provocation and anything that remained in proximity. Primeape extended that rage into something almost philosophical, described in entries as never ceasing its anger, the creature in a permanent state of fury, without a source that its documentation could identify. Whether Primeape's perpetual anger represented a psychological state, a neurological condition, or simply a characteristic of the species that the Pokédex language of anger was not quite equipped to describe, accurately was a question the entries left open in the way that questions about Pokémon interiority were consistently left open. Growlithe appeared on specific routes in Kanto, but only in one cartridge version, the other replacing it with Vulpix. This version exclusivity placed the two fire-type canine and fox creatures in a relationship where one region of player experience contained one and another contained the other, despite both supposedly inhabiting the same geographical location. The ecological implication was that Growlithe and Vulpix occupied the same niche in overlapping territory without coexisting, which could reflect either competitive exclusion between the species in actual Kanto ecology, or simply the game design decision that the world building did not fully account for. The routes where these Pokemon appeared were otherwise identical between versions. The difference was real within each player's experience and absent from any description of the world. Poliwag's swirling belly pattern was described as the spiral of internal organs visible through its translucent skin. The observation that a creature's digestive system was legible from the outside as a visual feature, and that this visual feature had become so characteristic that it defined the species' appearance, placed internal biology on the exterior in a way that raised quiet questions about how Pokemon bodies worked at a basic structural level. Poliwhirl's swirl changed appearance depending on its angle of movement, which entries described as an afterimage effect. Poliwrath, the fighting evolution, was documented as swimming without rest, its stamina described as essentially unlimited in water. Politoed, the alternate evolution available in later games, revealed that the evolutionary path was not fixed even in creatures where it had appeared to be, that external conditions could redirect development in ways the original three-stage line had not suggested were possible. Abra slept for 18 hours each day and could only use its psychic abilities while sleeping. When awake, it was defenseless. This biological arrangement, in which capability and vulnerability existed in perfect opposition, made Abra one of the most difficult Pokemon to encounter meaningfully, since its primary response to a waking encounter was to teleport away before any interaction could occur. The relationship between sleep and ability, between the conscious mind at rest and the psychic capacity that required that rest, implied something about the nature of psychic energy in the Pokemon world that the entries described as a characteristic of Abra specifically without connecting it to any broader framework of how psychic ability worked. Machamp had 4 arms and was documented as capable of throwing an opponent in any direction with only the briefest contact, its strength sufficient to move mountains according to some entries. The 4 arms were described as a species characteristic without explaining how a species with 4 arms had evolved in a world otherwise populated by creatures with either 2, 0, or entirely non-standard appendage arrangements. Whether the 4 arms provided a specific competitive advantage that explained their development, whether Machamp's ancestral form had possessed 2 arms that split over generations, or whether the creature simply existed as it was without evolutionary narrative available to describe it, was information the entries did not contain. Bellsprout's roots could penetrate concrete to seek moisture, its flexibility described as sufficient to dodge attacks that should have connected with something possessing a physical body. Weepinbell opened to consume large prey, its digestive acids strong enough to dissolve material quickly enough to threaten most living things placed inside it. Victreebel, the final form, lured prey with scent before consuming it, its interior capable of breaking down almost anything into nutrients. The predation pattern of this line, from passive moisture seeker to active ambush predator with a fully functional digestive cavity, was one of the clearest examples in the Kanto roster of evolutionary development, producing something that functioned as a genuinely dangerous organism by any reasonable assessment. The Safari Zone hosted wild Victreebel without protective infrastructure for the trainers who walked through it. Tentacool's tentacles introduced a toxin described in entries as extremely potent, one that affected creatures quickly enough to be considered acutely dangerous. Tentacruel extended this with up to 80 tentacles capable of covering a wide area simultaneously. The open water routes of Kanto were populated with Tentacool and Tentacruel in numbers that made water travel a consistent encounter with genuinely venomous creatures. The HM Surf, which allowed trainers and their Pokemon to cross water, placed the player in direct and frequent contact with this population. The animated series depicted tentacruel swarms threatening coastal communities at scales that reflected the numbers the route encounters implied. The games themselves treated the encounters as routine. The accumulated context of what those encounters actually involved was something each player assembled from entries and experience independently. Geodude's Raka exterior was its body rather than a shell. The stone was the creature, was not something the creature wore. Graveler gathered that mass as it grew, rolling to accumulate size and density. Golem, the final form, shed its outer shell each year, in a process the entries described as an annual molting event during which the shell cracked from internal growth and fell away to reveal a fresh layer beneath. The cyclic nature of Golem's development, a creature that annually replaced its exterior while maintaining continuity of identity across those replacements, was one of those biological details that implied more questions about continuity and identity than the entries engaged with. Whether the shed shells retained any connection to the creature that had worn them Whether each new layer represented a distinct phase of the same life or simply continuous replacement was left unexplored. Ponyta ran almost immediately after birth, its legs capable of supporting its weight within hours of being born. The fire on its body was described as harmless to its trainer once the bond between them had developed, but injurious to anyone else on contact. This selective harmlessness, a biological property that activated differently depending on the creature's relationship with a specific person, implied a somatic awareness of social bonds that had no straightforward biological explanation. The fire did not analyze the identity of whoever touched it through any mechanism the entries described, yet it responded differently based on the relationship. Whether this was presented as a mystery or simply as a documented characteristic without requiring explanation was never addressed because the entries offered it in the same factual register as all the other things they described. Rapidash's mane burned at temperatures hot enough to ignite most materials on contact. It ran at speeds that placed it at the upper range of documented land creatures in the region. The combination of speed and fire produced an image of a creature moving fast enough that the fire trailing from its body created a continuous stream of ignited air behind it. Whether this actually happened, whether Rapidash left a temporary trail of burning atmosphere during a full-speed run, was something the entries implied without confirming. The practical consequences of that trail for the terrain Rapidash crossed, and for anything traveling the same path shortly after, were not addressed. Slowpoke's tail was described as edible and considered a regional delicacy in certain areas. Team Rocket, in later games, was documented as cutting Slowpoke tails for commercial trade, treating a part of the creature's body as an agricultural product to be harvested and sold. The cruelty of that practice was acknowledged within those games as a plot motivation for challenging Team Rocket. But the baseline fact that Slowpoke tails were consumed by people as food existed in the lore independent of Team Rocket's harvesting. The broader human relationship with Pokémon in the Kanto world included consumption of Pokémon-produced items and apparently some Pokémon parts, a dimension of the human-Pokémon relationship that the games touched near and then stepped back from without committing to examining it. Magnemite was attracted to electrical equipment and drew power from it, described as essentially feeding on electrical current. Multiple Magnemite were noted to gather around power infrastructure and draw enough current to cause outages. 3 Magnemite sometimes linked together to form Magneton, producing a magnetic field powerful enough to affect compasses and electronic equipment at considerable distances. The mechanics by which 3 separate Pokémon could merge into a single evolved form, whether Magneton was one entity or 3, in close coordination, and what happened to the individual Magnemite identities during that merger, were questions the entries created by describing the outcome without explaining the process. Farfetched's population decline due to hunting was one of the few places in the original games where the Pokémon world's documentation acknowledged that human behavior had meaningfully reduced a species. The detail was noted in entries without dwelling on it, presented as historical information rather than ongoing crisis. Whether conservation efforts had been established in response, whether the population had stabilized or continued to decline, and what the region's relationship with that decline looked like from the perspective of the people who had caused it, were questions the entries raised by documentation without following through. Doduo ran despite lacking wings, its 2 heads sometimes disagreeing with each other about direction according to some entries. Whether this described actual conflict between distinct consciousnesses occupying different heads of the same body, or was a metaphorical way of describing biological indecision that resulted in observable hesitation, was not clarified. Dodrio, with 3 heads, extended this to documented 3-way conflict during emotional responses, with different heads reportedly expressing different emotions simultaneously. The question of how many conscious experiences existed within a Dodrio at any given moment, and how those experiences related to each other and to the creature's behavior as a unified organism, was introduced by the entries and left precisely there. Seal lived in icy water and hunted beneath ice sheets by sensing vibrations through the ice surface. Dugong slept beneath ice completely, surfacing only when necessary. The entries describing Dugong's sleeping patterns noted that it could remain beneath ice for extended periods, its body temperature regulated to maintain function in water cold enough to be dangerous to most species. How Dugong managed the physiological challenges of sleeping in near freezing water while maintaining the metabolic activity necessary to sustain life was presented as a documented characteristic without the biological detail that would explain the mechanism. Grimere formed from polluted sludge, described in early entries as having originated in industrial waste before developing into an independent biological entity. This origin story placed Grimer in the unusual category of a Pokémon that appeared to have been created by human activity rather than having existed in the world independently prior to human development. If Grimer genuinely formed from pollution, then its existence was evidence of something the Pokémon world rarely acknowledged directly: that the relationship between human development and the natural world had consequences that produced new kinds of life. Mook extended this, covering areas in toxic coating that persisted and spread. Whether the world of Kanto considered Grimer and Muck problems to be managed or creatures to be coexisted with was information the games left to interpretation. Shelder's shell was described as harder than any known material in some entries, capable of withstanding attacks that destroyed other surfaces. The clamping force of its shell closing was documented as enough to crush stone. Cloyster extended this defensive capability into something that entries described as nearly impenetrable under normal conditions, the shell hardening further in water and providing protection robust enough to survive almost any documented attack. The question of how Cloyster moved, given that its primary defensive mechanism was a shell that closed completely, was one that the entries answered only by describing its spikes as capable of firing in combat, leaving the locomotion question unaddressed. Ghastly's gas composition was noted in some entries as toxic, the gases surrounding it capable of causing unconsciousness in humans exposed to it for extended periods. Whether the presence of Ghastly in Pokémon Tower, an enclosed multi-story building where monks lived and worked, posed an ongoing health risk to those inhabitants, was something the entries implied without the game's acknowledging. The monks who maintained the tower appeared healthy in every in-game interaction. Either the gas was not as dangerous in brief exposure as the entries suggested, or something about the tower's ventilation or the monks' long-term adaptation had resolved what should have been a significant occupational hazard. Onyx was one of the largest Pokémon documented in the original roster, a chain of connected stone spheres that moved through the earth by burrowing at speed. The tunnels left by Onyx were described as causing ground vibrations that could be felt from the surface, its passage through soil and rock documented as powerful enough to reshape underground geography. Steelix, the evolved form available in later games, had developed steel-level hardness through its time underground, the geological pressure of years of burrowing hardening its body beyond what any surface creature could achieve. The patience required for that process, and what Onyx experienced during the decades of underground movement that eventually produced a Steelix, was biological time at a scale that the entries marked with material outcome without describing the experience of duration. Drowsy's dream-eating behavior was documented in ways that connected it to human mythology around sleep disorders and nightmares. Entries in later games specifically noted that children who had their dreams eaten repeatedly began showing psychological effects, the removal of dreaming content affecting their mental state in measurable ways. Whether this described something the Pokemon world's medical knowledge had formally documented, whether there was an understanding of what regular dream consumption did to the minds of those subjected to it, was not elaborated. The entries existed as warnings that the games never connected to a protective infrastructure that would respond to the danger they described. Krabby lived near the ocean and was noted as extremely common in coastal areas, its claws capable of regenerating if lost. The regeneration of limbs was documented as a species characteristic without connecting it to any broader biological framework for how regeneration worked in the Pokemon world. Whether other Pokemon with similar biological situations could regenerate lost parts, whether the capability was limited to certain body types or biological lineages, was not addressed in any systematic way. The entry documented Krabby's specific regenerative capacity as a fact of that species without it becoming a window into wider understanding of Pokemon biology. Voltorb's documented tendency toward spontaneous explosion meant that any environment where Voltorb existed in numbers carried inherent instability. The power plant with its large Voltorb population was an unstable environment by default, the generators maintaining electrical function alongside creatures capable of random detonation at any moment. That the power plant continued to function at all, continued to supply power to Cerulean City and the surrounding area, despite being populated by self-destructing electric creatures, was either a testament to the structural robustness of the facility or evidence that Voltorb explosions were less frequent in practice than the entries suggested. Neither explanation was offered. Exegcute existed as a cluster of 6 egg-shaped creatures that communicated through telepathy and made decisions collectively. The entries describe them as damaged when separated, suggesting that the collective function of the group was necessary for full biological expression of the individual units. Executor, the evolved form, possessed multiple heads that each housed a distinct brain with its own perspective and personality. The entries noted that if a head fell from Executor, it could continue as a new Execute cluster. The cycle of growth and separation documented in this line described a biological relationship between individual and collective that operated differently from any standard model of organism identity, a creature that was simultaneously many and one in ways the entries described as natural history. Cubone's mask was the skull of its deceased mother, and the entries described it as crying beneath that mask every night in mourning for her loss. The image of a small Pokemon sleeping beneath its mother's skull, weeping in the dark, was one of the most affecting pieces of lore in the entire original roster, and one of the most direct statements about grief, loss, and the emotional lives of Pokemon that the games made anywhere. What Cubona understood about its situation, whether its grief was accompanied by something like memory of its mother, whether it associated the skull with protection or simply with absence, was left to the reader. The Pokédex documented the behavior without analyzing the inner experience behind it. Marowak resolved something of that grief through evolution, the entries noting a harder psychological exterior, developing alongside the physical changes. Whether Marowak had processed the loss its Cubone form carried, or simply built defenses around it, was not addressed. The bone it wielded had been its mother's before it became its own weapon. Whether carrying that bone represented continuation of grief or transformation of, it was another question the entries introduced through description and left for each person to answer for themselves. Hitmonlee's legs stretched to kick at distances the Pokemon's standing reach did not suggest were possible. The extending leg mechanism was documented as a physical capability of the limbs themselves rather than a psychic or elemental effect, placing it in the category of biological structural capability rather than special ability. Hitmonchan moved its arms fast enough that the attacks were described as nearly invisible, the speed creating the appearance of punches from a creature that appeared momentarily stationary. Whether either Pokemon's documented combat capabilities would be consistent with any physical model of how limbs could function was a question the entries did not invite. Lickitung's tongue, already documented as twice the creature's body length, was described as leaving a numbing residue on anything it contacted. The tongue was the creature's primary sensory organ, as well as its primary means of manipulating objects, meaning that the same appendage used for environmental exploration left behind a pharmacologically active substance on whatever it touched. Whether Lickitung experienced the world through a numbing filter as a result of its own tongue's residue, whether the creature had developed any tolerance to its own chemical output, was not addressed. The documentation of a creature whose primary sense left traces behind that affected everything it investigated was presented as unremarkable natural history. Chansey's healing eggs were produced on demand and described as containing complete nutritional profiles capable of restoring health in unwell or injured beings. The biological efficiency implied by eggs that served as comprehensive medical treatment required a metabolic system capable of synthesizing precisely calibrated nutritional content on a flexible schedule. Whether Chansey's metabolism was simply an extreme version of standard egg-laying biology or required some fundamentally different biological process was not documented. The entries confirmed the capability and the value placed on it by people and Pokemon alike, with the healing properties treated as a feature of the world rather than a mystery within it. Tangela's unknown interior was one of the clearest cases in the original roster of a Pokemon whose documentation acknowledged ignorance rather than asserting knowledge. The researchers who compiled Pokédex entries for every other species had managed to observe enough to provide descriptions of appearance, behavior, and habitat. For Tangela, the vines were the only consistent observation. What moved beneath them, how the creature processed sensory information, how it ate or reproduced, were questions the documentation acknowledged as unanswered by recording what it did not know alongside what it did. That candor was rare enough to be notable. Kangaskhan's pouch-born young were visible in every depiction of the adult without being encountered separately. Whether the young depicted in the pouch were different individuals across different encounters with Kangaskhan in the wild, whether each Kangaskhan carried a specific child through that child's development until it was old enough to emerge and establish its own life, or whether the relationship between parent and child in this species followed a pattern the entries had simply never described, was information the games never provided. Later games would eventually reveal Kangaskhan young as a distinct battling partner during a mega evolution form, but the origin of each young one and the full arc of the relationship between parent and child in this species remained only partially documented. Horsea emitted ink as a defensive measure, generating a smokescreen that obscured pursuit while it fled. The ink was documented as containing properties that made it difficult to see through, even with light. The cloud it created described as darker and more opaque than ordinary squid ink. Seadra's scales were noted as sharp enough to injure incautious handlers, its entire body functioning as a weapon even when the creature was not actively defending itself. The transition from a small creature that fled behind ink clouds to one whose passive surface was dangerous to touch was another evolutionary escalation the entries documented without explaining what selective pressure produced it. Goldine's horn was described in some entries as strong enough to break stone. The image of an ornamental-looking fish with a strength-to-appearance ratio that dramatic was one of those Pokemon details that rewarded reading the entries over simply observing the creature in encounters. Seeking used that same horn to hollow out spaces in riverbeds for egg-laying, the environmental modification for reproductive purpose reflecting a level of behavioral sophistication beyond simple instinct. The hollowing of stone riverbed for reproductive habitat implied spatial planning, memory of suitable locations, and the physical capability to execute a project requiring repeated application of force over time. Staryu and Starmie both displayed a gem that was described as the core of the organism, the most vital structure in its body. Pokédex entries noted that Starmie's gem flashed in patterns that researchers had attempted to decode, believing the patterns constituted a form of communication. Whether anyone had succeeded in making sense of what Starmie was communicating, whether the signals were a response to external events or continuous broadcasting, and whether the claimed interstellar transmission capability of the gem meant that whatever Starmie was communicating was being sent somewhere beyond the planet, remained questions the entries introduced through description without bringing to any resolution. Mr. Mime's ability to create physical barriers through pantomime represented a category of capability that the game's typings and move systems categorized as psychic without explaining why enacting the idea of a wall created a real one. Whether Mr. Mime understood what it was doing, whether the physical creation of barriers was an intentional act performed with awareness of its mechanism, or a capacity that expressed itself through the mime behavior without the creature knowing why, was documentation the entries did not attempt. The entries described what Mr. Mime could do. The question of what it understood about itself doing it was left entirely open. Scyther's blades were described in some entries as sharp enough to cut through even hard materials with minimal effort, the result of biological keratin structures refined over generations of combat in the wild. The speed at which Scyther moved its arms during combat was documented as too fast to follow visually at close range, which placed its attack pattern in a category of speed where reaction-based defense would be essentially impossible. Yet the battle system placed Scyther in the category of difficult but catchable creatures. The system that translated those documented capabilities into the mechanics of catching and containing Scyther was, like all such systems in the original games, explained by convention rather than by any in-world logic. Jinx's vocalization was described as sounding like human speech without the content mapping to any known language. The entries noted that people who heard Jinx vocalize sometimes found themselves involuntarily mimicking the sounds, a response that happened below the level of conscious decision. Whether this was a form of psychic influence, an acoustic phenomenon where certain frequencies prompted imitation in human nervous systems, or something that Jinx produced and used deliberately, was documentation that the entries introduced as a strange fact and did not pursue. The involuntary mimicry, if it actually occurred as described, would represent an ability to affect human behavior directly through sound alone, a capability with implications the entries simply did not examine. Electabuzz gathered near power plants, drawn to the electromagnetic fields that high-voltage equipment produced. The entries noted that the electricity in Electabuzz's body interfered with electronic equipment in proximity, the creature's own biological output, affecting technology built by humans to manage similar forces. Whether the people of Kanto had developed methods for working safely near Electabuzz, whether the interference they caused was a manageable characteristic that had been designed around overtime or an ongoing practical problem without solution, was information the world implied through the presence of the power plant and its inhabitants without making explicit. Magmar's body temperature was described in entries as reaching levels that caused the surrounding air to distort visually, the heat bending light the way high-temperature surfaces do in the natural world. A creature operating at those temperatures would be generating more thermal energy than its biology could plausibly sustain through metabolic processes alone, raising the same fundamental question about energy sources that appeared repeatedly across the original roster. Where did that energy come from? The entries noted the capability. The source remained one of the consistent, unaddressed questions distributed through the documentation. Pinseer's horns could lock around opponents, and apply enough force to tear them apart according to some later entries. The capability was described as the result of leg strength rather than arm strength, Pinsir using its entire body weight to enhance the grip of its horn. Whether this represented a type of predation that Pinsir used in the wild, whether the behavior described was something it performed on prey regularly or deployed only in defensive situations, was left to interpretation. The safari zone, where wild Pinsir could be found and attempted to be caught using bait and rocks rather than conventional battle, was an environment where that predation capability was present without the player's standard system of engaging with it. Tauros moved in herds and attacked by charging with its horns, using its three tails to lash itself into a state of aggression before initiating contact. The tail lashing behavior as a self-stimulation mechanism for producing aggressive arousal was one of the more specific behavioral details documented for any Kanto species, a Pokémon that needed to psych itself up before combat in a way that was observable and described. Whether this was a ritual behavior fixed by biology or a learned pattern that individual Tauros developed through experience was not addressed. The specificity of the behavior as a documented characteristic of the species suggested enough consistency across individuals that it reflected species-level biology rather than individual habit. Magikarp's retained ability to survive in extremely polluted water was documented in entries as a survival adaptation developed over the long period of its decline from ancient dominance. The entries noted that its adaptability to poor water quality was among the few remaining capabilities it possessed at a high level, everything else having diminished over generations of reduced selective pressure. Whether this narrative of decline was accurate to the Pokemon world's ecology, or a reading of Magikarp's simplicity backward from the result, the picture it painted was of a species that had once been consequential and was now a shadow of that earlier version of itself, surviving in conditions other species could not tolerate because it had lost the capabilities that would have kept it in better conditions. Gyarados' rage, once triggered, was documented as producing atmospheric effects in some later entries, the intensity of its anger affecting weather conditions in the immediate vicinity. The connection between emotional states and weather was a pattern that appeared in several Pokemon species, as though the relationship between strong psychological experience in Pokemon and physical environmental phenomena was a feature of the world rather than a specific quirk of individual creatures. Whether this was documented anywhere within the world's scientific understanding, whether researchers had formalized the connection between Pokemon emotional states and environmental effects, was not information the entries contained. Lapras was described as gentle and intelligent, capable of understanding human language and carrying people across water with care. Its intelligence was documented as sufficient to recognize and remember individual humans across encounters, suggesting a level of individual recognition and memory typical of highly social mammals in the natural world. Lapra was also documented as approaching near extinction due to hunting, a species whose intelligence and gentleness had made it easier to approach and therefore more vulnerable to human predation. The fact that the same entry system that documented Lapras's intelligence and near extinction made it available as a gift Pokemon inside Sylph Company headquarters, where a single Lapras was offered to any trainer who happened through at the right moment, placed conservation concern and casual acquisition in uncomfortable proximity. Ditto's cellular architecture was so flexible that it could replicate not just appearance, but biological function at the level required to produce viable offspring with nearly any species. The implications of that flexibility for what Ditto actually was, whether it had a natural form from which it transformed, or whether it was only ever transformation, whether Ditto in its default state was itself, or simply the resting expression of a biology that existed to become other things, were questions that the entries introduced by describing what it could do and left hanging at exactly the point where they became interesting. The Pokemon world contained within it, across those 150 documented species, and the routes and towns and caves where they lived, a complete alternative natural history. Not a replacement for the natural world, but an addition to it, an ecology of the extraordinary existing alongside the ordinary, in ways the games treated as normal because the people who inhabited that world had always known it to be true. Every creature carried within it a question. Every entry in the Pokédex was a doorway to something that could not quite be fully answered. The world of Kanto was dense with this kind of unresolved wondering, and that density was not an accident. A world built to be explored required interior space, room that could not be reached, no matter how many times the routes were walked. The questions were that space. There is one final detail worth sitting with before the journey ends. The name of the region itself, Kanto, was drawn from a real place in Japan, a region that contains some of the most densely populated land in the world. The developers who built the fictional Kanto had grown up in that real place, or near it, and they built a world that reflected their experience of geography and community and daily life, even while filling it with creatures that had never existed. The fictional Kanto and the real Kanto share a shape, a logic, a sense of towns connected by paths between them. Beneath the adventure, beneath the mysteries and the legendary Pokémon and the criminal organizations and the championship, there was always a real landscape dreamed into something extraordinary, a familiar world made wonderful by creatures that existed only in the imaginations of the people who created them and the people who found them waiting in the tall grass. The lights of Kanto have dimmed now, settled into the kind of quiet that belongs to late hours and closed eyes. The roots are still. The Pokemon in the grass are resting. Somewhere along a dark sea route, the shadow of something enormous moves just beneath the surface, noticed by no one. The caves hold their silence. The tower in Lavender Town stands as it always has, and all along the paths between the towns, between the gyms and the caves and the city streets and the ocean channels, the questions remain exactly where they were left, patient and unhurried, waiting in the dark for anyone willing to drift a little further in to find them. Thanks for watching. There is another quiet journey waiting just to the left of your screen, and it will be there whenever sleep finally takes you.